Welcome, night watchers, to Nakora nights. Canada's small towns look peaceful from the outside. Snow-covered streets, quiet neighborhoods, friendly faces. But when the temperature drops and the sun disappears before evening, those towns change. Behind every frosted window, every empty road, every silent main street, there's a story whispered that no one wants to admit is true. Tonight, we're uncovering 10 true Canadian small-town horror stories. Real accounts from places so isolated, even the police hesitate to drive out there after dark. A house where the lights flickered in perfect rhythm, even without power. Footprints in the snow leading to a door, but never away from it. And a woman seen standing by a frozen lake, hours after she'd been declared missing. These aren't myths. These aren't rumors. These are the stories people in those towns still refuse to talk about. Before we step into the cold, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Because if it's late, the silence around you might not be just silence. If you're brave enough to walk with us into the snow, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I'm not alone tonight. Now, pull your jacket tight, keep your eyes on the tree line, and don't follow any footprints you see outside your window. This is 10 Untold Most Disturbing True Canadian Small-Town Horror Stories. Let's begin. Landon Pierce always believed small towns kept their secrets buried, yet he had spent his whole life trying to unearth them. On the night he finally told this story, he said only 2 lines before everything inside him shifted forever. He said the truth was never lost. It was only waiting for someone brave enough to listen. He grew up far from anywhere loud, the kind of boy who collected silence like other kids collected toys, the kind who walked dirt roads at dusk trying to hear the world breathing under the trees. He became a storyteller by accident, first writing notes about strange things he heard on empty trails, then sharing them with people who whispered the same unease he felt. By the time he reached adulthood, his name carried weight in forgotten towns across northern Canada, not because he was famous, but because he had seen things he wished he could unsee. That winter he arrived in Brook Pine, a fishing village near the northern edge of Lake Athmore, a place with barely 400 people where the fog rolled in low and cold every morning. He came there to help run the community newsletter, to write small reports about weather, local events, fishing updates, nothing dark, nothing strange. He thought it would be easy, something quiet, something that would help him heal after years of chasing stories that never let him sleep. He did not know that Brook Pine was waiting for him the same way a forest waits for a spark. He learned about the missing child on his second week in town. Her name had been Rowan Hart, 9 years old when she vanished from the Brook Pine Summer Jubilee, a tiny festival on the empty shoreline behind the fire hall. People still flinched when her name came up in conversation, even though many years had passed. Landon read the old reports, pages yellowed and damp in the town's archive room, and something about the case dug into his ribs like a cold finger. Summer that year had been soft and bright, warm air drifting across the lake, families gathering in the open field lined with pine forest on 3 sides and a gray-blue stretch of water on the other. Rowan's parents kept her close that day, nervous without knowing why, watching her run around with other children, her bright green dress easy to spot in the crowd. Landon imagined the music drifting across the field, the smell of grilled corn and fried dough filling the air, children laughing near the game booths, adults chatting under the tent roofs while the sun slid toward the horizon. Then came the moment no one could explain, the quiet slip of a child into the space between one blink and the next. Rowan had asked if she could walk to the face painting booth near the tree line, barely 20 meters from where her family sat on a picnic blanket. Her mother watched her join the small cluster of children waiting their turn, watched her bright dress sway gently in the breeze. Then her older brother distracted her with a question, something quick, something harmless, and when her mother looked back, Rowan was gone. People first assumed she had wandered toward the food stalls or the games, but when her mother hurried to the booth, the volunteer remembered the girl clearly. She said Rowan had stepped out of the line and walked toward the trees. She had not looked frightened or lost, just curious, as if someone had called her name. Landon imagined the rising panic, the searching voices calling her name across the field, the way dozens of people joined the search within minutes, sweeping through the games, the tents, the shoreline. By the time the sun dipped below the lake, someone had called the provincial police. Officers arrived in minutes, forming search groups, setting up floodlights, bringing in dogs and drones, checking every path into the woods. Volunteers brought flashlights, wandering into the dark forest where the air turned heavy and the silence thickened into something living. For 2 full weeks, they searched the island-like peninsula, every trail, every abandoned shed, every narrow stretch of rocky shoreline. Boats combed the lake at dawn. Helicopters scanned the treetops with thermal cameras. Nothing. No footprints, no torn dress, no dropped toy, no sign of struggle. Rowan seemed to have stepped out of the world itself. Police investigated everything, every visitor log, every ferry crossing from the mainland, every suspicious vehicle reported that week, but nothing aligned. No one had seen her after she stepped toward the trees. Landon read every line of the old notes, feeling a cold pull in his stomach, something familiar and heavy. He had told many stories of strange disappearances, but something about this one felt different. It felt like the forest itself had made a decision. Rowan's family never gave up, but as years passed, their hopes sank under the weight of unanswered questions. Eventually, they stopped attending the Jubilee. Eventually, they stopped answering reporters. Eventually, they left Brookpine altogether. Time marched forward, but the wound stayed open. Then came the afternoon. Everything changed. It happened exactly 3 years after Rowan vanished, almost to the hour. A woman walking her dog along the back trail behind the Hart family's old home stopped when she saw a small figure step out of the trees. A girl in a clean green dress. A girl with long dark hair tied back with a ribbon. A girl who looked exactly 9 years old. The woman froze, heart beating so hard she felt it in her teeth. She recognized Rowan at once, even though the child had not grown a centimeter. She called Rowan's mother, who was living 2 towns away at the time. Rowan's mother drove faster than she had ever driven in her life, barely able to breathe when she saw her daughter standing in the front yard. Rowan asked why she was crying. She said she had only been gone for a short while. She said she had been playing with other children and did not know why anyone was upset. Landon imagined the way Rowan's mother must have collapsed around her child, the way the world must have tilted sideways in that moment. Police arrived quickly, taking them to the regional hospital for examination. Doctors found no malnutrition, no dehydration, no injuries, no signs she had been living in the wild. Her dress was spotless, every thread intact. Her hair still held the ribbon exactly as it had the day she disappeared. But the detail that shook the entire medical team was her age. She had not aged at all, not a single inch. Not a single pound gained or lost. Not a single tooth changed. She was biologically the same 9-year-old girl she had been 3 years before. Rowan spoke calmly when doctors and investigators asked where she had been. She described a wide house in the woods, filled with bright rooms and many windows. She said she had played games with children there and that kind adults had watched them. She did not remember eating or sleeping. She did not remember being cold or scared. And she insisted she had only been in the woods for one afternoon. When investigators asked her to lead them to the house, she agreed. She walked ahead of them confidently, almost joyfully, like someone following a familiar path that others could not see. Then she stopped in a small clearing and pointed to empty air. She said the house was right there. Investigators saw nothing but trees. The clearing held no foundation, no debris, no broken wood, no sign any structure had existed within the last 50 years. Dogs found nothing. Ground-penetrating radar found no hidden cellar, no tunnels, no buried rooms. Experts studied the soil and found no disturbance. Rowan became distressed when they told her nothing was there. She trembled, insisting she could still see the house, the wide windows, the long hallway, the children playing inside. Landon pushed the archives aside and stared at the wall, heart pounding. The case had caught international attention back when it happened. Scientists, psychologists, conspiracy theorists, paranormal researchers, All tried to explain the lack of aging. None succeeded. Rowan eventually grew again at a normal rate, but she developed nightmares, anxiety, and intense fear of forests. She refused to go near trees, shaking violently if someone tried to guide her near them. Her family moved away quietly, avoiding reporters who hunted them for interviews. Rowan rarely spoke about what happened again. Now Landon felt the same weight her family must have carried. He had come to Brook Pine to escape darkness, but instead he had stepped into the heart of another unsolved wound. He wanted to close the case in his mind, to treat it as something strange but distant, but the town did not let him forget. Every night something unusual scraped its way into his world, small details first, then things he could not deny. On his third night in the apartment tower where the town put him up temporarily, the elevator on the 12th floor began moving on its own. He heard it at 2:43 a.m., the motor humming softly behind the wall, the doors sliding open with a long breath. He stepped into the hallway and saw the elevator sitting open, empty, yet he heard the sound of someone breathing inside. Slow, hollow, echoing. He backed away slowly, feeling the hallway grow colder. Another night, he passed the closed subway entrance downtown, an old sealed tunnel left over from a transit project cut decades ago. The metal gate was locked with steel bars. Yet he heard it rattle violently from the inside, shaking as if someone were dragging their hands across it. When he shone his light toward it, the noise stopped. Then came the ride requests. An Uber driver living in the same building as Landon told him that he kept receiving ride requests from a passenger who had died in 2016. The same name, the same profile picture, the same pickup spot every time, right at the edge of Willow Trail, the path leading into the woods where Rowan had reappeared. The driver had never accepted the ride, but the request always came at the same time, 2:17 a.m., as if someone were urging him toward the trees. Landon's hands shook when he wrote these details in his journal, because the more he looked at Rowan's case, the more everything in Brook Pine seemed to pulse with the same strange heartbeat. He felt watched on the trail behind his building, even in broad daylight. He saw children in the corner of his eye that vanished when he turned. He heard laughter in the trees. Soft, distant, wrong. One night he woke to the sound of small feet running down his hallway, light and quick. He opened his door and saw nothing but the far end of the corridor, pale and still under the emergency lights. Something inside him whispered that he was being guided, nudged toward the forest the same way Rowan had been. He resisted, staying indoors at night, locking his windows, avoiding the edge of town where the trees pressed close, but Brook Pine watched him, and the forest waited. He made the mistake of returning to Rowan's clearing alone one afternoon, wanting to see for himself if anything felt different. The sky was pale, the wind cold, and the trees stood tall around the opening. He stepped into the clearing and felt the air change, growing warm, thick, heavy with the scent of something sweet. Then his vision blurred for half a second, and he saw the outline of a house, faint and bright as if shaped from sunlight, its windows glowing softly, its walls stretching wider than seemed possible. Children laughed inside it. He stumbled back, heart racing, and the vision snapped away like a pulled string. From that day on, something followed him home. He woke to faint breathing at the foot of his bed, steady and slow, like someone waiting in the dark. He heard small knocks on his door at night, soft at first, then slightly heavier, then soft again, like fingers tapping a pattern. At dawn, he found small footprints on his balcony floor, prints that continued to the railing and stopped, as if something had stepped over the edge and disappeared. Whispers floated through his vents at night, faint voices asking him questions he could not understand. Sometimes he woke with his curtains open, even though he always closed them before sleeping. Sometimes he found pine needles scattered across his living room floor. He told himself he was imagining everything: stress, lack of sleep, overwork. But the forest does not care what a man tells himself. On the night everything broke, Landon heard a gentle tapping on his window at 3:18 a.m. He sat up slowly, pulse pounding. The sound continued, soft and rhythmic. When he gathered the courage to approach the window, he lifted the curtain barely an inch. A small face looked back at him, pale and expressionless, eyes wide and dark, hair floating as if underwater. Moonlight glowed behind it, yet the face cast no shadow. Landon fell backward, scrambling away from the window, heart hammering against his ribs. The tapping continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly. He did not sleep after that. The next evening, he packed his bags, telling himself he would leave the town at dawn. But while he was folding his clothes, he heard the hallway elevator move again. Slowly, softly, softly. Stopping at his floor, the doors slid open, and he heard breathing echo inside the shaft. Inside his room, the lights flickered. Then the radio on his desk turned on by itself, playing faint static. Through the static, he heard children laughing, the same soft, distant sound he had heard in the clearing. His phone buzzed. A new Uber request notification popped up. Same passenger, same picture, same pickup location. 2:17 a.m. Landon backed toward the door, but something was already standing behind it, tall and shadowy, blocking his exit. He did not see its face, but he felt its weight, its cold presence pressing against the air. He whispered a prayer he barely remembered from childhood and ran to the balcony instead. The night air hit his face like ice. The forest stretched out in the distance beyond the town lights, dark and waiting. Behind him, the sliding door began to open slowly even though he had locked it. A small handprint appeared on the glass. Landon climbed over the railing and lowered himself onto the fire escape, breath shaking uncontrollably, fingers trembling so badly he almost slipped. Something moved inside his apartment, soft footsteps crossing the floor, stopping near the window. He climbed down the fire escape ladder, dropping onto the empty parking lot. He sprinted toward the street, lungs burning, shoes slapping the pavement. The wind carried faint laughter behind him. He reached the main road, running until the apartment tower vanished behind rows of houses. When he finally slowed to catch his breath, he stood alone under a broken streetlight flickering weakly above him. Then he heard a child's voice whisper behind him, so close he felt the breath on his ear. "Do you remember me yet?" He ran again. He reached the edge of town and kept running until dawn broke across the lake. He never went back to Brookpine. He never wrote about it publicly. He never told anyone what he saw in the clearing or at his window. He only shared it once, in a quiet room with the lights turned low, saying that some stories were not meant to be told, only survived. People asked him why the forest took Rowan but returned her unchanged, and why it tried to take him later. Landon never answered. He only said the forest chooses, the same way a house chooses its doors, and sometimes a place reaches out not for harm but for company. No trace of him exists after that final telling. He left the town claiming he needed rest, but he never reached the place he was traveling to. His car was found abandoned near a wooded trail hours away, the driver's door open, the engine cold, and a bright green ribbon lying on the seat. No footprints led away from the car, none led toward it. Some nights, people say they see a figure on the 12th floor of an old apartment tower in Brookpine, watching from a balcony rail that should be locked shut. Others say they hear laughter drifting out of the sealed subway entrance downtown. Drivers still receive ride requests at 2:17 a.m. from a passenger who no longer exists. And sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the forest is still, a faint voice rises between the trees, soft and familiar, asking the same question again and again. Do you remember me yet? And if you have a story idea you'd like me to cover next, feel free to share that too. If you haven't already, a like and subscribe would mean a lot. And also, you can share this with your friends. Love you all. Rylan was a 44-year-old mobile repair technician living in the small lakeside town of Brookhaven in northern Manitoba. He spent most days fixing generators, radio towers, and heating units for the tiny communities scattered across the cold wilderness. The job paid enough to keep him steady, and the long drives between towns gave him time to think. He liked quiet roads, the sound of the heater humming, and the feeling that the world slowed down out here. He had lived through hard years when he was younger, including a rough childhood with poverty pressing against every window of his house. Growing up, he always wanted a life that stayed simple and safe. He took pride in being dependable, someone who followed rules and avoided trouble. In more than 20 years of driving, he had never caused an accident or faced anything frightening on the job. In early March, Ryland was assigned a long route that stretched from Brookhaven to the tiny northern settlement of Frosthaven, a route that wound through old forests, abandoned logging roads, and empty flats where no home stood for hundreds of kilometers. The drive was nearly 1,000 kilometers in total, moving through areas where cell service faded away, where only lonely radio towers flickered green in the night. He had driven the route many times before. Frosthaven was small, barely 24 people, but they relied on their radio equipment and generators to survive winter. Ryland knew the work mattered. He had learned to drive through blizzards, icy curves, and long stretches of road where the only signs of life were animal tracks in the snow. On the evening of March 7th, he locked up his shop, loaded extra tools, warm clothes, and fuel into his service van, and began the drive. The sky was clear, and the cold bit softly at the edges of the windshield. He liked traveling at night. Traffic was nearly zero, and the weather stayed stable. The service van hummed along the two-lane highway with only the frozen dark spread around him. He passed old farmland, frozen riverbeds, and miles of sleeping pine forests. He stopped only to stretch, drink coffee, and refuel. He was making excellent time when dawn crept up on the horizon. By the morning of March 8th, he crossed into deeper wilderness where the road narrowed and the last signs of nearby towns disappeared. He knew he still had about 4 hours before reaching Frosthaven. He always stopped at a tiny rest pull-off near a closed ranger station, about 90 kilometers south of the settlement. The place was simple, only a small parking area, an old bulletin board, and a pit toilet. But it was a familiar spot where he liked to breathe fresh air before pushing through the loneliest part of the route. When he pulled in, no other vehicles were there. The wind didn't even blow. Snow covered the ground in thin patches, and the air smelled like frozen pine sap. He grabbed his thermos, stepped out of the van, and walked toward the ranger station door. But something caught his eye before he reached it. A slim leather notebook lay on top of the old wooden bench near the entrance, placed neatly, almost like someone wanted whoever stopped here to pick it up. The notebook looked dry even though the air was damp. It didn't look dropped or left behind by accident. It looked placed. Ryland frowned, feeling uneasy, but he reached down and picked up the notebook. The cover was plain with no name. When he flipped it open, he saw page after page filled with careful handwriting, dates, times, descriptions of vehicles. Not short descriptions, but detailed records of vans, trucks, and cars. The make, the color, the dents or stickers, even the license plates. He flipped to more pages, lines running in clean rows, more vehicles. More times, more places. All the places were along the northern highway systems in Manitoba and the territories above. Many were near this very road. Some were near roads he had repaired radio towers on. As he scanned the pages, his stomach tightened. At the bottom of each page, spaced after a group of 3 or 4 vehicle logs, a single word was written in big capital letters. Claimed. He counted quickly and saw around 70 vehicle descriptions in total. The dates stretched back more than 8 years. The most recent entry was from only 4 days ago. He froze. This was wrong. This was not a journal someone kept for fun. The word claimed sent a cold spark through his bones. He looked around the empty rest area. No cars, no tracks besides his own. The forest stood silent in all directions. He realized he felt exposed. He walked swiftly back to his van, locked the doors, and breathed hard through his nose until his pulse calmed down. He looked at his phone. No bars, of course. This stretch of road had no signal. He needed to drive at least 40 kilometers south to reach a small service station that kept one old payphone inside. Before he left, he took photos of every page of the notebook, holding the camera steady even as his hands trembled. When he reached the last pages, he paused. A license plate number looked familiar. He grabbed his service papers and checked. The plate belonged to one of the repair vans used by another technician named Jonah. Jonah handled northern generator repairs and had been on the northern route more often than anyone else. Ryland had not seen Jonah in a long time, maybe months. He tried to remember if anyone mentioned him recently. He thought about calling his dispatcher but knew he had no cell signal here. He set the notebook on the passenger seat and started the engine, eager to leave. He drove back onto the highway, checking his mirrors constantly. The road behind him stayed empty, but he could not shake the feeling that someone might be close, just hidden. He reached the service station 40 minutes later. The place was small, with a single fuel pump and a dim interior where a tired older man sat behind the counter. Ryland stepped inside and asked to use the payphone. He dialed the provincial emergency line and waited as the ring buzzed in his ears. When a dispatcher answered, he explained where he was and what he found. He told her about the notebook, the long lists of vehicles, the word claimed, the dates, the locations. The dispatcher spoke calmly but firmly, asking him to stay at the service station until officers could reach him. He hung up and asked the attendant if the cell signal worked here. The man nodded. Ryland stepped to the side and called his company dispatcher. His voice shook as he asked if anyone had heard from Jonah recently. His dispatcher paused, then said Jonah had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. His repair van had been found empty on a frozen access road. No tracks, no signs of struggle. Just gone. The investigation was still running. Ryland felt dizzy. He swallowed hard and explained the notebook entry tied to Jonah's van. His dispatcher said she would call investigators right away. Ryland stepped outside to breathe cold air. He waited in his van until 2 RCMP officers arrived almost an hour later. He handed them the notebook and showed them the photos on his phone. They asked where he found it, what he touched, whether he saw anyone nearby. He answered each question carefully. The officers took the notebook as evidence and asked for a formal statement. He agreed. They logged his information and told him he was free to continue once the interview concluded. He resumed his drive toward Frosthaven but felt haunted by the discovery. The dark forest seemed deeper than before. The road looked stretched and empty. The silence around him felt too heavy. When he reached Frosthaven, he fixed the generator system quickly and checked into a small lodge. He tried to sleep but closed his eyes only to picture pages filled with names and numbers. In the following days, investigators contacted him repeatedly. They cross-referenced the license plates in the notebook with missing persons reports. 21 plates matched abandoned vehicles found over the last 8 years across northern regions. Many drivers had never been found. None of the cases had been connected until now. The notebook suggested something organized, something stalking drivers on isolated roads. They told him they were searching for whoever wrote the logs. They set up cameras at the rest area. They watched for days and weeks, but no one returned. The place stayed quiet. Nothing moved except trees and snow. Other technicians and drivers started reporting strange things. Some said they saw a vehicle following them for hours before vanishing. Some saw people standing in rest areas who did nothing, only watched. Some found small items left on the road or by their tires as if placed with intention. Ryland felt anxiety eating away at him. He avoided northern routes for a while. He heard others talk about hearing footsteps outside their trucks at night, but when they shined their flashlights, they saw only wet soil with fresh footprints. Some drivers in condo buildings in Brookhaven reported hearing a child laugh in the hallway even though no children lived there. A bus driver told police he kept seeing the same woman waiting at the same stop night after night, but she never boarded, and the bus CCTV showed no one standing there at all. Rumors grew until fear spread through the community. Investigators asked Ryland weeks later to return to the rest area with them. He agreed reluctantly. He walked them through every step he took, from picking up the notebook to walking back to his van. Officers searched the grounds but found nothing new. No more notes, no more signs. Months passed before officers arrested a man linked to one missing driver's abandoned vehicle, a drifter living near the northern road. He admitted to rummaging through empty cars but denied taking anyone. His fingerprints did not match any inside the notebook. With no evidence, he was released. The investigation reached a silent standstill. Ryland struggled mentally. Each time he fixed equipment in remote places, he felt watched. He stopped at no rest area unless other vehicles were present. He felt unsafe in quiet rooms. Still, he returned to long routes because work demanded it. The police kept the notebook locked away as their only clear clue. They could not find the writer. They could not prove what claimed meant. They could not explain why someone followed vehicles for 8 years. They could not explain why someone left the notebook for Ryland to find. One evening in early winter, when Ryland was driving home from a service call near the edge of Brookhaven, he felt the sense again, that heavy watching from the darkness outside the headlights. The road twisted along a thick forest just before reaching town limits. Snow fell in faint streaks across the windshield. He tried to calm himself with slow breath, knowing fear had been shaping his mind for months. But then he saw it. Someone stood on the shoulder of the road, facing the forest, not moving, not reacting to the van passing by, not even turning their head. As the light swept over them, Ryland looked for the shape of a face or clothes, but the figure held no clear details, almost like a shadow pretending to be a person. He slowed down but did not stop. When he checked the mirror, the figure was gone. He sat shaking behind the wheel. Days later, he told investigators, but they had no answers. The sense of danger grew thick in his chest. He eventually left long-distance repair work. The fear had dug too deep. He took a small job fixing appliances inside Brookhaven, staying close to town. But he never forgot the notebook. Sometimes he wondered if more notebooks lay hidden on other roads, documenting other names. He wondered if someone kept watching drivers even now. Some nights he woke at 2:17 a.m., hearing faint noises outside, like footsteps in wet dirt even when no rain had fallen. Some nights he looked out his window toward the forest and thought he saw a figure standing still among the trees before fading back into darkness. He still dreams of the pages written in careful letters. The word claimed, sitting under rows of names. The fear that something organized waited out there. Something that followed. Something that watched. And he still wonders why that notebook was left where only he would find it. Mara Birch had always felt like the quiet corners of the world were watching her. And on most days she tried not to think about it. But on that cold spring morning she could not stop wondering if she had walked into the wrong part of her own life. She was a 34-year-old tax clerk living in Winnipeg when she received the call that changed everything. Her aunt, Lorraine DeVoe, had passed away at the age of 86 after a slow illness, leaving Mara the old family homestead deep in a remote part of northern Ontario. The land sat outside a tiny town called Coldwater Ridge, nearly 2 hours north of Sudbury, surrounded by thick woods, crooked back roads, and long stretches of quiet that made your own heart beat too loud. Mara had not seen that house in over 21 years. She had been a kid then, running through fields and forgetting to be afraid of the shadowy tree line that always felt too close. She remembered the smell of pine, the distant cry of loons, and the way her aunt would always lock every door before the sun even touched the horizon. The house had been built in the late 1800s and had stayed in the DeVoe family for 4 generations. It stood on 30 hectares of mixed woodland and old farmland, far from any neighbors. The land dipped toward a ravine where thick moss covered broken rocks, and an abandoned well sat with its rotting cover half collapsed. The place had always felt older than the house itself, like the ground had memories long before humans stepped on it. Mara drove there in early May of that year to start clearing out the belongings, planning repairs, and deciding whether she should sell or keep it. The roads narrowed as she drove, swallowed by forest. Her car hummed through long tunnels of branches that nearly scraped the roof, and a strange fog rolled in, hugging the asphalt even though the sun was shining. By the time she pulled into the long driveway, her hands were trembling, and she tried to tell herself it was only the drive, only nerves, only the weight of returning somewhere she had not seen since childhood. The house looked tired but still standing strong. The wood siding had darkened with age. The windows sagged slightly, and the porch leaned like it carried a secret it could not hold much longer. Her aunt had lived alone for the last 15 years, keeping to simple routines and avoiding anything that changed too fast. The first 2 days passed quietly. Mara sorted through bedrooms and the kitchen, finding the ordinary leftovers of a long life, old shoes, faded coats, dusty photo albums, handwritten recipes, chipped teacups, nothing strange or surprising. It was on the third day that everything shifted. She decided to clean the attic, a long cramped space where the roof slanted so low she had to bend. The air tasted like dust and old wood. Boxes were piled everywhere, mixed with forgotten furniture, broken lamps, cracked frames, and trunks filled with fading linens. She worked through everything with slow patience, pulling out boxes, making lists, moving things aside. But then she saw it. A wooden chest shoved into the far corner beneath the rafters. It was hidden behind 2 old suitcases and a stack of folded blankets. The chest was dark, about 1 meter long, heavy, and sealed with a thick iron padlock. She searched the upstairs rooms for keys. Nothing. She checked the main floor. Nothing. Finally, she explored her aunt's bedroom. In the bottom drawer of the nightstand, she found a small tin box. Inside were several keys, some modern, some old, rusty, and brittle. One had a strange carved pattern on its handle, its metal worn smooth with time. It looked like it belonged to the chest. She returned to the attic, knelt before the chest, pushed the key into the lock, and turned. The click was sharp, echoing too loudly in the small space. Inside the chest were envelopes, dozens of them, stacked neatly, their paper yellowed and fragile. Each was written in French, the handwriting elegant but trembling. Mara picked up the first letter. It was dated April 12, 1941. It opened with a simple greeting to a dear friend. The writer was someone named Celine. As Mara read, her stomach tightened. Celine wrote about hiding in a farmhouse. She wrote about fear. She wrote about footsteps in the woods during every full moon. She wrote about voices calling her name from the darkness, scraping at the windows, brushing against the walls. She wrote that she could not go to the authorities because no one would believe her. The letter ended with a plea for someone to come help before the next full moon. Mara felt her skin crawl. She grabbed the next letter. This one was dated May 17, 1941. The tone was frantic. Celine wrote about someone chasing her through the woods. She wrote about hiding in a cellar for 2 days without food or water. She wrote about strange markings carved into trees, symbols she did not recognize. Letter after letter told the same story, each one darker and more desperate. There were 36 letters in total, stretching from February to December of that year. Each one described shadows moving through the trees, torches flickering between branches, animal remains left near doorsteps in bizarre patterns, faces appearing in windows at night. The final letter, dated December 19, 1941, was almost unreadable. The writing slanted wildly across the page, words repeated. Lines crossed over each other. It ended mid-sentence. They are at the door, and I cannot run anymore because that was it. Mara stared at the page, her hands shaking. She did not know who Celine was. She did not know why these letters were hidden in her aunt's attic. She did not know why the final page ended with such terror. She spent the evening making calls, searching online, reaching out to local archives and historical groups. By nightfall, she had found something that made the air around her feel colder. A woman named Celine Marchand had lived in the region during World War II. She had been 21 when she was reported missing in January of 1942. A search party had found her body 3 weeks later in the woods, 8 kilometers from the DeVoe homestead. The official cause of death was exposure to cold, but the autopsy mentioned bruising and trauma that did not match a simple accident. It also mentioned that her wrists and ankles had strange marks like bindings. The report listed signs of malnourishment, like she had been without food for a long time. Mara felt her breath stick. She contacted the local police, asking if records still existed. They found old files. They sent them. The police notes described the autopsy, the strange wounds, the long starvation, all dismissed as confusion or stress from the war years. They also described other strange events in the area during that time. Farmers finding animal bodies placed in patterns, people reporting torches moving through the woods at night, symbols carved into trees. One report mentioned a farmer hearing something walking across the snow outside his house around 2:16 a.m. The crunch of footsteps even though no one was there. Another report mentioned a traveler who stayed in a hotel in Sudbury and saw someone else's reflection standing behind him in the bathroom mirror, even though he was alone. Another mentioned a woman in an apartment in Thunder Bay who heard a voice from her locked basement whispering in a French accent, "Ouvre la porte," asking her to open the door even though no one was inside. All these reports floated around the same winter, the same woods, the same fear. Mara felt sick. She took the letters to a historian in Coldwater Ridge. The historian confirmed they were from the 1940 era. The paper, the ink, the writing style all matched. But she had no idea why they were in the DeVoe farmhouse or who the letters were meant for. Mara asked surviving relatives if anyone knew a woman named Celine Marchand. No one did. Her mother said she had never heard of her. No one could explain why the letters were locked away or why her aunt never spoke of them. Mara searched deeper. She met with elderly residents. Most knew nothing, but one man, 93 years old, remembered stories. He remembered warnings to stay away from certain parts of the woods. He remembered whispers about people disappearing during the war. He remembered his father saying that torches used to move between the trees late at night, silent and slow. He refused to say more. Mara also discovered that other people had gone missing between 1940 and 1944, 11 in total. Some had later been found dead with strange wounds. Some were never found. All the deaths were labeled accidents or disappearances caused by the chaos of wartime. But the more she read, the more she felt something tying those cases together, something no one had ever dared name. She continued her research for months, traveling back and forth from Winnipeg to the homestead. She hired a genealogist who discovered that Celine and her aunt were distant relatives, linked through a common ancestor from the 1800s. This meant Celine might have sought refuge with someone in the DeVoe family, which explained the letters, but still left dozens of questions unanswered. As Mara pushed deeper, she felt resistance. Old residents avoided her. She received anonymous calls telling her to stop. Once, during an interview, an elderly woman became pale and begged her to leave the house. Mara felt the whole community hiding something beneath a thick blanket of silence. The more she asked, the more doors closed. Eventually, there were no more leads. The truth had died with too many people. She could not force answers out of a past buried under fear. She decided to keep the house but refused to ever live in it. The feeling of the woods pressing close made her chest tighten. The letters made the walls feel heavy. She donated the documents to provincial archives and wrote a report about everything she had found. No historian has been able to explain who the men in the woods were, or why the patterns, the symbols, the torches, and the voices kept appearing. No one knows if a group existed or if something else haunted the forest during those years. Even today, some locals say that on cold nights you can hear footsteps on the old roads near Coldwater Ridge, fast and sharp against the snow, even though the street is empty. Some guests at an old lakeside hotel swear the bathroom mirror sometimes shows someone standing behind them when no one else is in the room. Some people in nearby apartments claim the basement whispers to them in a soft French voice, asking them to open the door even when the basement is locked. Mara still visits the farmhouse once every few months to check on the property. She never stays after dark. She never walks near the tree line. She never looks toward the ravine. And she always locks the doors long before the sun sinks. The forest around Coldwater Ridge holds its silence tightly, as if waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. Liam grew up in a coastal village called Brenton's Cove in Newfoundland, a lonely place surrounded by cold water and thick forests, where the fog rolled in so quietly that you didn't notice until the world disappeared. His father was a fisherman, his mother worked at the diner, and he had spent his teenage years wandering abandoned trails along the coast, learning early that the forest could feel different on certain nights. He worked now as a storyteller for a digital magazine that collected strange wilderness events across Canada, a job that came to him after he survived something he still could not explain, something that happened when he was 22. It changed the way he breathed, the way he slept, the way he saw the world. That same wound inside him is what pushed him to tell other people's stories. He lived with the fear that if he ever stopped telling stories, The memories of his own night would crawl back to him in full. This is the story he chose to tell tonight. Far away from Brenton's Cove, in the community of Raventon Ridge in northern Alberta, a woman named Clara disappeared and reappeared in a way that made no sense to anyone who searched for her. Clara was a 26-year-old graduate student from Montreal, studying wildlife ecology at the University of Northern Alberta. She had a calm nature, quiet eyes, and a deep love for the outdoors. She grew up hiking through provincial parks in Quebec with her aunt, learning everything from fire safety to knot tying to how to predict weather by reading the clouds. She planned a weekend camping trip with 3 friends she trusted deeply. They wanted to explore the backcountry of the High Stone Provincial Range, a sprawling wilderness of mountains and valleys about an hour outside the town of Raventon Ridge. The group had been planning this trip for weeks, checking trail maps, preparing gear, and making sure they had enough supplies for 3 days. Their small group was made of Clara, her roommate Sylvia, and 2 classmates named Rowan and Caleb. They hiked into the park on a warm Friday afternoon in early July, walking about 8 kilometers from the trailhead to a remote campsite near a narrow lake shaped like a crooked finger. Even though the area was remote, it wasn't empty. Across the lake were a few scattered tents belonging to other backpackers, but none close enough to hear the group's voices unless they shouted. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, warm sun during the day, and cool, gentle air during the night. After setting up their tents, they cooked dinner, shared stories about their university classes, argued playfully about who burned the rice, and sat around the fire as stars came out one by one. Around 9:30 in the evening, Clara stood from the fire and said she needed to use the backcountry toilet that was about 70 meters away along a narrow trail through tall spruce trees. She took her flashlight and disappeared through the tree line while the others continued talking and scraping their bowls clean. After 10 minutes, Rowan glanced at the trees and said it felt like she was taking longer than usual. Sylvia called out Clara's name, no answer. She tried again, louder. Still no answer. Sylvia decided to walk to the toilet area to check. Her flashlight cut through the darkness as she followed the narrow path until she reached the simple wooden structure. Clara was not there. Sylvia called her name again, waving the light around the trees. Silence. She hurried back to camp and told Rowan and Caleb that Clara was nowhere in sight. The 3 of them immediately began searching. They walked the trail again and again, shining their lights everywhere. They called Clara's name until their throats hurt. They walked further into the forest, listening carefully. Nothing. No sounds except their own feet crushing pine needles. By midnight, they were frantic. The only thing they could do was hike back to the trailhead in total darkness, a dangerous decision but necessary if they wanted cell phone reception. They reached the parking lot after hours of nervous walking, called emergency services at 2:10 in the morning, and explained everything. Search and rescue arrived at first light. Teams began sweeping the area in concentric circles. Helicopters flew overhead, sweeping the terrain with thermal cameras. Volunteers gathered, ready to walk through thick brush. Search dogs were brought in by mid-morning. Hours passed, then days. Dozens of people searched the mountainside for Clara, covering nearly 20 square kilometers of steep land, but they found nothing. No footprints leading away from the campsite, no clothing. No signs of a struggle, nothing that suggested where she had gone. On the 4th day, searchers found something that made the entire situation stranger. About 3 kilometers northeast of the campsite, deep in dense forest with no trail leading to it, lay Clara's sleeping bag. It was spread out flat on the ground, almost too neatly arranged, like someone had laid it out carefully before lying down, even though no one could have slept there comfortably because the ground was uneven and full of exposed roots. There was no backpack, no food, no footprints around it. Nothing but the sleeping bag. Search teams intensified their efforts around that area, combing every meter they could reach. They looked for caves or hidden ravines. They looked for animal dens. They found nothing. Then, on the 6th day after she vanished, a search dog alerted its handler somewhere far from both the campsite and the area where the sleeping bag was found. Nearly 4 kilometers from the campsite, in a thick stretch of cedar trees, they discovered Clara. She was alive. She stood barefoot in a small clearing, slowly walking in tight circles like she didn't know what she was doing. Her clothes were the same ones she had worn the night she disappeared. Her hair was tangled. Her eyes were open but empty, not focusing on anything around her. The handler called for paramedics. They reached her within minutes. Clara was conscious but did not respond to questions. Her skin was cold, but her core temperature was fine. She was mildly dehydrated, exhausted, but otherwise physically unharmed. She was airlifted to Raventon General Hospital, where her family and friends rushed to see her. Medical exams revealed something that confused every doctor who saw her. Clara had been missing for 6 nights in wilderness where the temperature dropped near freezing. She had no food or water with her, yet her body showed no signs of starvation or severe dehydration. She had no frostbite, despite being barefoot for who knows how long. Her feet had only minor scratches. Her skin had no mosquito bites, no cuts from branches, nothing that suggested she had been wandering through harsh forest. It was as if she had not spent 6 days outside at all. The more troubling issue was her mind. Clara did not speak for the first 24 hours. She stared at the ceiling and blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream she couldn't escape. Brain scans showed no injuries, no swelling, no damage. By the second day, she began to talk again, but she was confused. She recognized her family, but she didn't understand why she was in a hospital bed. When her friends explained what happened, she listened quietly, then shook her head. She remembered leaving the campfire to go to the toilet. After that, her memory was blank. No images, no sounds, no sensations. Nothing until she woke up in the hospital. Her friends were questioned repeatedly, but their stories never changed. She had been gone no more than 15 minutes before they realized something was wrong. That small amount of time did not match the impossible distance she had traveled. Searchers tried to retrace her possible routes. None made sense. There was also the sleeping bag, found 3 kilometers away, neatly arranged like someone had made a bed. Clara had not taken it when she walked to the toilet. Her friends swore they saw it inside her tent. Investigators had no explanation. Her shoes were never found, not a single shoelace. It was as if they had disappeared from existence. Over the months that followed, Clara struggled with night terrors so violent that she woke up screaming without knowing why. She developed a fear of forests. She quit her field research program because she couldn't handle the feeling of trees around her. Doctors labeled her symptoms as PTSD, but Clara insisted she did not remember anything that could have traumatized her. Stranger still, she experienced brief episodes where she lost minutes of time. One moment she would be in her kitchen, the next she would be standing by her front door, unsure how she got there. Doctors found no neurological explanation. The episodes slowly decreased over a year but never fully disappeared. Liam paused before continuing the story because what came next connected to things he had seen in his own life and in other cases he had collected. Strange occurrences began happening around Raventon Ridge after Clara came home. Early morning fog rolled across the town near the old municipal buildings, and people reported seeing a dark figure walking slowly along the metal boundary rails, but guards claimed no one had entered the restricted area. A resident living near the main street said he smelled cigarette smoke out on his balcony in the middle of the night, even though no neighbor smoked. He walked outside and saw nothing but fog, but the smell lingered like someone had just exhaled beside him. Down by the Raventon Canal late at night, people claimed they heard heavy breathing echoing across the water, but the surface stayed perfectly still, no ripples, no one swimming. These reports began within a week of Clara's return. Liam kept digging into the story because it felt familiar. He compared Clara's case to several others across Canada, including one in the Yukon, where a park ranger vanished for 4 days and was found brushing snow off a tree branch with no memory of leaving his cabin. Another case in British Columbia involved a child who disappeared from a campsite and was found 12 kilometers away with clean feet despite walking barefoot across sharp rocks. But Clara's case disturbed him the most because her psychological symptoms matched the ones he experienced after his own incident in Brenton's Cove. He continued the story. Clara eventually returned to classes, completing her degree but choosing a job that kept her indoors, working for an environmental data firm in Calgary rather than doing field work. She avoided the outdoors. Even walking past a heavily wooded park made her breathing tighten. She moved apartments twice because one of her windows faced a line of trees that made her nervous at night. Her friends stayed close to her, but the experience changed their relationship. Every time they got together, there was a quiet space between them that none of them could cross. They avoided talking about the missing days. They avoided the question that hung in the air: what happened during the time she could not remember? Years passed, but the questions remained. Liam had traveled to Raventon Ridge to interview Clara privately. She agreed only because he promised not to publish her real name. When they met, she seemed gentle but hollow, like someone trying hard to stay grounded in a world that kept slipping sideways. She told him she sometimes felt watched when she walked near wooded areas. She never saw anyone, but she felt something she could not explain. She said she sometimes woke up at night to the faint scent of damp moss in her apartment, even though she kept no plans. When Liam left her apartment that evening, he walked past a line of trees near the sidewalk and felt the air grow colder even though the summer sun was still bright. He heard a faint sound, like someone exhaling slowly behind him, but when he turned, no one was there. He said nothing to Clara. He didn't want to add to her fear. As he researched more, he found one last detail that tied everything together. One of the search team members had been reviewing old GPS data from the days they looked for Clara. On the second night, long after the rest of the searchers returned to camp, one dog handler recorded hearing a strange rhythm echoing through the trees near the lake. It sounded like slow steps circling the search area, but no footprints were found the next morning. The handler did not report it officially because he thought he was hearing things. But when he heard about how Clara had been found walking in slow circles days later, he felt sick. He believed he had heard something following her trail. Liam did not write that part in his published article. He didn't want to push the town into panic. But he kept it for himself. Clara never returned to High Stone Provincial Range. She refused every interview request from reporters. She tried to move on, but according to what she told Liam, she still lost small pieces of time every few months. She still dreamed of walking in circles in a forest she didn't recognize. She still felt something standing far behind her whenever she walked alone at night, as if waiting for her to notice. Liam ended the story the same way he ended every story he collected from survivors. Some people come back changed. Some people come back carrying something with them. Some people come back, but they don't come back alone. Ronan had always preferred working alone, moving quietly through dim hallways late at night where most people hated to be, and by the time he turned 24, he already had the kind of quiet patience that made him good at long shifts. He had grown up in a small fishing town on the eastern edges of Alberta, raised by a grandmother who cleaned offices at night and taught him that darkness was only scary when you chose to let it be. He believed that for most of his life, until the year he accepted a job that broke something inside him forever. Ronan was hired in the fall of a cold year to watch over a shuttered heritage museum in a small Canadian town called Cold Pines, a place surrounded by forests so thick the sky looked bruised by the treetops. The building was huge and lonely and scheduled for demolition in a few months, and his duties were simple. He had to make sure no one broke in, walk the perimeter every hour, and report anything suspicious to the demolition company. Teenagers had a habit of sneaking inside abandoned places, and the company feared an accident before the teardown. The Cold Pines Regional History Museum had been built in 1930, a stone structure with a copper roof that had turned green over the years. It had hosted school tours, elderly knitting clubs, and history lovers from all over the province. But funding dried up, repairs grew too expensive, and the building shut down 5 years before Ronan arrived. A developer bought the land and planned to replace the museum with apartments. Until then, they needed someone to watch it, someone who wouldn't mind the creaks or the cold or the echoing quiet. Ronan started on the 23rd of September. His shift ran from 9 at night until 6 in the morning, 5 nights a week. The building had 3 floors above ground and a basement full of storage exhibits that had never been shown to the public. His small office sat beside the front entrance, holding an old desk, a portable heater, and a monitor that showed several low-quality security camera feeds. The first 2 nights slipped by without incident. The museum felt gloomy but not threatening. with dusty cases, old photographs, faded banners, and mannequins dressed in clothes from past centuries standing stiff and silent. Ronan walked his rounds slowly, listening to the building sigh and settle. He kept his radio at his side and spent the rest of the night reading, but on the third night, everything changed. At 10:31 p.m., while sitting in his office, Ronan heard something drifting through the halls, a faint noise that felt out of place in a shut-down building. It was music, light and childish, like children humming together in a low tune. The sound was muffled, as if it came through a thick wall. He froze. The humming lasted around 10 seconds and stopped abruptly. Ronan stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped into the main hall. He listened, waiting, but the building returned to stillness. He started walking, checking the first floor, then the entrance halls, then the display rooms filled with antique farming tools and old fur trading artifacts. Nothing moved, nothing hummed. The building only offered the kind of silence that made his heartbeat sound too loud inside his ears. He returned to the office unsettled. He tried to blame the sound on wind slipping through broken window panes or the heating system cracking somewhere deep in the basement, but he didn't fully believe himself. When the humming came again at 11:39 p.m., louder this time, drifting up from the basement level, he knew it wasn't the wind. Ronan hesitated, remembering the building notes that told him to avoid the basement unless necessary, since most of it remained cluttered with old furniture, broken glass displays, and stacks of boxed archives. But he had no choice. He had to check. He found the basement access door beside the main staircase and went down slowly. His flashlight beam glowed across the old stone walls and wooden shelves stacked with crates. The air smelled like dust, metal, and damp air trapped too long underground. The corridor stretched long and narrow, lined with doors that had peeling paint. Some stood open, showing exhibit pieces that had never reached the main floors. Old wagon wheels, chipped stone carvings, award plaques from forgotten festivals, and a row of mannequins missing arms or heads. As Ronan walked deeper, something strange appeared beneath his boots. Papers. First a few sheets scattered randomly, then more, until the floor held a carpet of documents. He crouched, lifted one, and saw an old museum inventory sheet dated 1964. It listed items for a children's display exhibit that never opened. He picked up another, then another. Each paper involved artifacts that belonged to children who once lived in Cold Pines long before the museum even existed. He stood, shone his flashlight farther down the hall, and saw dozens upon dozens of these papers everywhere. Why were these records here? Why were they scattered on the floor instead of boxed or stored properly? Archives were supposed to be cataloged or destroyed, not dumped like this. He kept walking until he reached the final door at the end of the hall. Unlike the others, this door was metal and painted a dull gray. It had a small reinforced window and a serious lock, the kind used on restricted spaces. Ronan tried the handle. Locked. He stared through the tiny window, but all he saw was black. He returned to his office and called his supervisor, leaving a message about the scattered papers and the locked door. The supervisor called back 15 minutes later, telling him not to enter the basement again unless absolutely necessary. The company already knew the building held old records. A team would come in the following week to clean everything before demolition. Ronan accepted the answer even though it didn't settle his nerves. The next night, he tried to ignore the basement. But at 10:21 p.m., the humming returned. It floated up from below, louder now, blending several children's voices humming in a sad, slow rhythm. Ronan stayed in the office for 30 minutes, trying to pretend he didn't hear it, but the sound crawled under his skin. At 11, he had enough. He grabbed his flashlight and headed down. He followed the corridor straight to the locked gray door. The humming rose clearly from the other side. Ronan pressed his ear to the cold metal. The tune was fuller now, carrying more voices, and something about it sounded mournful. He called out, demanding whoever was inside to answer him. The humming stopped immediately. Silence. Ronan waited. Nothing happened. He banged on the door, but no response came. He stared again through the window, but the darkness inside didn't budge. He hurried upstairs and called his supervisor again, insisting someone was in the building. The supervisor said the noises must be echoing from somewhere outside and bouncing strangely through the old halls. Someone would check the next day. Ronan hung up, unconvinced, and remained tense the rest of the night. Nothing else happened, but the humming didn't stop. Over the next week, he heard it every night, always rising from the basement, always stopping the moment he approached the gray door. He stopped going down there. He didn't want to know what sang on the other side. Cold Pines felt different during those nights. Ronan would finish his shift at sunrise, walk back to his small rental cabin on the northern side of town, and lie awake long after exhaustion should have pulled him under. He'd hear strange stories from locals, like the taxi driver who kept picking up a passenger late at night and dropping him at a house empty since 1999, or the motel worker who heard heavy boots walking down a carpeted hallway where no footsteps should echo, or the mall guard who saw someone standing in the reflection of a glass wall even though the floor behind him was empty. Everyone in Cold Pines seemed to have a story they didn't want to tell fully. Everyone seemed worn down by something they didn't name. Ronan tried to ignore it. Then, on October 15th, something changed. At midnight, while walking the second floor, Ronan heard footsteps above him, slow and steady, moving across the third floor. He stopped and listened. The footsteps continued, crossing from one side of the building to the other. He called out softly, announcing himself. The footsteps stopped. He waited. Then they started again, faster this time. He climbed to the third floor. His flashlight scanned empty hallway after empty hallway. Dust coated the wooden floors and no footprints broke the layer. He kept moving, following the path where the sound had come from, until he noticed a door slightly hidden in an alcove. He hadn't seen it before. It was cracked open. Ronan pushed it slowly and saw a narrow wooden staircase leading up. He climbed toward the attic. The attic stretched long and wide, full of old museum props, crates, broken display stands, dusty banners, and more mannequins than he felt comfortable counting. His flashlight beam swept across a row of them when he saw something at the far end, a figure, small, still, facing him, the size of a child. Ronan's breath caught. He raised his flashlight higher. It was a mannequin, an old one, dressed in a pioneer-era shirt and trousers, its face smooth and blank. But its head was turned sharply toward him at an angle too unnatural for a mannequin left untouched. He called out, trying to steady his voice. The mannequin didn't move. He took a step closer, another. When he was about 5 meters away, the mannequin shifted, not like something falling or tilting. It turned its head slowly away, as if looking toward the far corner of the attic. Ronan stepped back, pulse racing. He didn't wait any longer. He ran, pounding down the hidden stairs, rushing across the third floor, then the second, then out through the main entrance into the cold night. He reached his car shaking so badly he dropped his keys twice. He called his supervisor and explained everything. The supervisor told him to go home. Someone else would finish the shift. The following day, Ronan met his supervisor and a maintenance worker at noon. They entered the building together, searching every floor. They found the attic. They found the mannequin lying on its side exactly where Ronan had last seen it. They found no signs of anyone living inside, no footprints in the dust, no evidence of trespassers. The supervisor offered Ronan a different assignment. Ronan declined. He didn't want another building. He didn't want any night shifts. He quit the job entirely. The demolition moved forward in January. Workers began tearing down the museum from the top floors toward the basement. When they reached the basement, they made a discovery behind a false wall in one of the storage rooms, a hidden space roughly 3 meters by 3 meters filled with old museum documents from 1940 to 1960 that had been deliberately concealed. The records documented donated childhood items belonging to children who vanished from Cold Pines during those decades, children whose disappearances were never explained, children believed to have drowned in the nearby lake or gotten lost in the nearby lake or gotten lost in the woods. But these documents revealed something darker. They described private experimental programs run secretly through the museum's founders, treatments involving sensory deprivation, locked rooms, and harmful tests that would never be allowed by modern standards. The discovery triggered a provincial investigation. Cold Pines residents who had lived through those years stepped forward, sharing pieces of memories they believed they had forgotten. The investigation confirmed abuses but didn't answer everything. It didn't explain why children hummed through the basement walls. It didn't explain why the mannequin turned its head. It didn't explain why Ronan still heard humming outside his cabin door some nights long after he left the job, soft voices rising through the forest behind his home, always slipping away when he tried to follow. Even now, years later, he tries to sleep with heavy blankets pulled to his chin, forcing himself to ignore the faint tune coming from the tree line, the one that begins every night at the same time, exactly 2:43 a.m., drifting slowly through the darkness like someone waiting for him to answer. Marin was a field ecologist working for a research program connected to the University of Alberta, studying the movement patterns of rare freshwater sturgeon in remote northern lakes. At 29 years old, she had already built a reputation for being careful, curious, and steady in moments when others lost their nerve. She grew up outside Kelowna, spending her childhood roaming creeks and marshes while other kids stayed indoors. Her father worked as a park ranger, and she loved following him on long walks where he pointed out animal tracks pressed into soft mud. After earning her doctorate in freshwater ecology from the University of British Columbia, she returned to the cold northern provinces for fieldwork that meant long days, hard drives on dirt roads, and lonely nights near silent water. In early summer, she traveled to the outskirts of a very small town called Clearwater Ridge, a quiet community of fewer than 2,000 residents tucked into the pine forest near the border of British Columbia and Alberta. The town rested beside Lake Havenstar, a deep glacial lake with water so dark that even in daylight it looked like polished stone. Old locals said the lake changed moods, sometimes calm as glass, sometimes restless even when the air was still. Many cabins stood along the edges, some rented by visitors, some left empty most of the year. The forest trails around the lake were thick with moss and fallen pine needles that softened footsteps, and at night, travelers sometimes reported hearing an invisible presence pushing small stones across the paths, as if something unseen crawled beside them in the darkness. Marin had been staying at a rented cabin on the lake's southern edge for 2 weeks while running daily surveys. The cabin itself was simple, just one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a screened porch looking over the water. Other renters before her claimed they heard scratching beneath the porch at night as if someone or something was dragging its knees slowly back and forth under the boards. Marin had laughed it off when she read the guest log, assuming it was a porcupine or raccoon. She arrived with a small aluminum research boat, her notebooks, several underwater cameras, 2 hydrophones, field trackers, and a sturdy GPS unit. Most days she went out alone, steering across the quiet water before the sun rose, listening to the soft hum of the motor. The lake, fed by hidden springs and narrow streams, was deeper than almost any lake in the surrounding region. Some divers claimed that nothing could reach the very bottom because the pressure grew strange past a certain depth. The locals had whispered for years about what moved under that lake. Some said shadows rose there at dawn. Some heard someone breathing beneath the surface early in the morning even when the lake was completely still, as if a man were just under the water gasping for air without a single ripple above him. Old fishermen said their lines were sometimes pulled down with a force strong enough to bend metal hooks into useless curves. Most people dismissed the stories as drunken tales told in the single bar on Main Street, but they stayed clear of the northern part of the lake anyway. On June 12th of that summer, at around 6:20 a.m., Marin left the dock near her cabin. She radioed her field partner back at the small community station, a graduate assistant named Lionel Graves. He logged her departure time and noted she planned to reach a point almost 12 kilometers northeast, near the place where the lake narrowed into a deep trench. The weather was cool but calm, the sky pale with early light, and the wind gentle enough that the water barely shifted. At 8:10 a.m., Marin radioed Lionel again. Her voice was steady but thoughtful. She said she noticed unusual commotion below the water close to her boat. She said the movements were large, stronger than anything she recorded during her previous days on the lake. Lionel asked for details. She said the motions were too organized, too smooth, and not like any known species. She added that she picked up low tones through the hydrophones that didn't match any reference sound in their library. She said they were steady vibrations, like something mechanical but alive at the same time. Lionel asked if she wanted to turn back. Maren said she wanted a few more readings. She had always been dedicated, and she rarely panicked even when conditions changed suddenly. She said she would update him again soon. She did. At 8:39 a.m., she made her second call. Her tone had shifted. She sounded uneasy, as if trying to keep her voice level while wrestling with a growing sense of dread. She said something was circling the boat. She said she could see shapes moving fast under the water, too quickly to be sturgeon. She said they moved together like a school, but larger than any group she had ever tracked. She said they were rising and sinking in careful patterns, and sometimes she felt the boat lift a little, as if the water below flexed upward. Lionel told her to return right then. Maren agreed. She said she was starting her motor. She said the sounds were getting louder. She said she felt a pressure under the hull. At 8:43 a.m., she made her final transmission. Lionel later told investigators her voice had changed so suddenly that it made his stomach tighten. She whispered at first, saying something was wrong with the water. She said the shapes were coming up. He asked her what she saw. She did not answer directly. She spoke in short breaths, repeating that whatever was rising was not a fish and not something known. She said they were not fish. She said it again and again. They are not fish. They are not fish. He asked her what they were. She began to speak, but the radio filled with a sharp, high-pitched noise that stabbed through the speakers, a sound Lionel could not compare to anything human or animal. It whipped through the room like a wail stretched too thin, trembling in a way that made his ears ring long after the signal cut off. Then the radio went silent. Lionel tried again and again to reach her, calling her name, switching channels, checking connections, shouting into the microphone. There was no response. The small research station quickly alerted local authorities. By 9:10 a.m., the regional emergency services contacted the RCMP, who then reached out to the nearest provincial rescue team. The lake was calm, the sky clear, and rescue boats left the dock only minutes later. A helicopter from a nearby firefighting unit was redirected toward the lake by mid-morning. Search and rescue crews spread across the water following the GPS path that tracked Maren's last known coordinates. At 2:15 p.m., they found her boat drifting near the northern trench, engine still humming faintly as it bobbed on gentle ripples. The boat showed no damage. All equipment was secure. Her jacket lay neatly on the back seat. Her water bottle sat upright by her notebook. Her life vest rested in the corner untouched. She always wore her vest. It was standard safety procedure. Yet she had removed it before whatever happened. The kill switch was still in place, meaning she had not been wearing the lanyard. Investigators later said she would never disconnect it without reason. Something made her take it off. Her cameras had been running until 8:41 a.m. The final images were 7 still photographs taken at half-second intervals. They showed nothing but the surface of the lake at first. Then in the last 2 frames, something massive and dark moved just below the water. The shapes were enormous and close, larger than anything that should have been in that lake. They blurred with motion, like muscles shifting under deep shadows. The hydrophone recordings captured in the last minutes were even more unsettling. Experts said the sounds were not matching any known freshwater species. They said the tones dipped too low for sturgeon or trout, too layered for anything natural. Some specialists said they reminded them of deep mechanical pulses, like a massive engine slowing down and speeding up in uneven patterns, yet the patterns had texture like breathing. Military officials confirmed no underwater testing sites were operating in that region. There were no submarines, no drills, nothing that could produce those sounds. The divers sent down into the trench found nothing except unnatural cold pockets and faint, dull vibrations under the mud. They said the deeper they swam, the more they felt watched. One diver surfaced early, pale and shaking, saying the darkness below felt like something waiting with its mouth open. The people of Clearwater Ridge talked in hushed tones in the days after her disappearance. Older fishermen said this was not new. They told investigators about nights when they saw glows under the lake as if faint lights drifted beneath the surface. They spoke about gear pulled downward with a force no fish could manage. They said more than once they felt the lake breathe. Local hikers said they often heard rocks sliding across the trail near the northern woods at night, as if something invisible moved alongside them, brushing through branches. People renting lakeside cabins said they heard scratching under their porches, soft and slow, as if someone crawled on their knees under the boards, dragging their palms. Investigators wrote these statements down but could not confirm any of them. They simply added them to the thick file growing on the desk of the RCMP officer leading the case. The university launched its own internal review, checking all safety protocols. They found Marin followed every required step except removing her life vest. They could not explain what made her take it off. They could not explain why she disconnected her kill switch or why she stopped recording 2 minutes before the final call. They could not explain the inhuman sound on the radio. They could not explain the massive shapes in the photographs. Her family visited Clearwater Ridge many times, speaking with investigators, walking along the lake shore, asking anyone who might know anything. They set up a research scholarship in her name. They waited for answers that never came. Months passed. The story spread across small online forums and local newspapers. Some people believe she fell into the lake and drowned, but that did not explain her calm boat, her undone safety gear, or the unsettling recordings. Others claimed the lake hid an undiscovered species. Others insisted the noise on the radio meant something unnatural. By winter, the case went cold. Yet strange reports did not stop. A year later, a fishing boat returned early one morning with 3 men on board, pale and shaken. They claimed enormous shapes swam beneath them near the northern trench, moving in circles. They said they heard something under the hull breathing heavily, like a man gasping for life just below the surface, even though the lake was completely still. They left their lines behind and sped back to shore. Authorities investigated but found nothing solid. Still, locals began avoiding that part of the lake after dark. Some refused to go there at all. One night near the end of autumn, a couple renting a lakeside cabin reported hearing soft dragging beneath the porch. They thought it was an animal until they listened closer. They said it sounded like hands pushing across the earth, slow and heavy, as if someone crawled just inches from them beneath the floorboards. They left first thing in the morning. Hikers walking the northern trail after sunset said they heard stones being nudged across the path by something they could not see, rolling softly as if an unseen figure paced beside them, never stepping out of the shadows. People in town said they sometimes woke in the early dawn hours to a faint hum coming from the lake. The sound was deep and steady, like a slow heartbeat echoing across the water. No one wanted to check what caused it. Years passed, but the lake remained restless. Some nights the water churned in one patch while the rest stayed still. Other nights, lights flickered beneath the surface like fireflies trapped under the waves. On quiet dawns, a few early risers swore they heard a single long inhale rising from the water, even though nothing above the surface moved. Local children grew up hearing warnings not to swim near the northern trench. Adults said it was too deep, too cold, too unpredictable. They never told the full stories. They never mentioned the old research boat found drifting with the engine still warm. They never mentioned the woman who vanished without a trace. But when the wind moved across Lake Havenstar in the early morning hours, some older residents claimed they still heard a soft voice drifting through the air, a voice calling for help, then fading into a trembling wail that hurt the ears. People said it sounded like someone trying to speak through rising water. Some said the voice belonged to Marin. The lake remained quiet during the day, reflective and peaceful, but every time fog gathered near the northern trench, it curled in strange shapes as if something beneath reached toward the air. Visitors often asked why no one fished that part of the lake anymore. Locals simply shrugged and said the water there had moods. Yet sometimes at 2:43 a.m., people living along the lake swore they saw a figure walk into the forest trail that ran toward the trench. A woman with dripping hair walked slowly, never looking up. Some said she disappeared into the trees as if the night swallowed her whole. Others said she knelt to touch the ground, and small stones moved aside by themselves as if greeting her. None of these sightings were ever proven. Still, some residents locked their doors early, refusing to listen when someone knocked softly after midnight asking, "Do you remember me yet? Do you remember me yet?" repeating the question in a thin voice that sounded almost familiar. The lake was simply a lake, the officials insisted. The forest was simply a forest. The people who disappeared near the water over the decades were listed as accidents or misfortunes. But the families left behind never felt satisfied. On clear nights when the moonlit water looked like black glass, some people believed they could see large, dark shapes drifting silently beneath the surface. They moved too fast to be fish. They moved too smoothly to be logs. They moved with purpose, circling, rising, waiting. And whenever someone asked about Maren Clark, the townspeople lowered their voices and said the same thing. The lake keeps its own secrets. The secrets. Dawson grew up in southern Ontario and spent most of his adult life moving from one newsroom to another, never staying long enough to settle, always searching for stories hidden behind quiet landscapes. He had a strange pull toward places most people forgot, and even when he was young, he collected old maps of towns that did not exist anymore. His parents thought he would become a teacher or a historian, but Dawson found himself drawn to abandoned settlements like they were calling his name. After university, he worked as a local reporter, covering storms and community events, until he realized he felt alive only when he dug through the dust of forgotten places. He left steady work in Toronto to become a traveling investigator, writing for any publication that cared about the strange corners of Canada. His articles focused on lost roads, empty houses, fading trails, and communities swallowed by snow or swallowed by time. He built a modest following online, enough to survive, enough to keep moving. His mind worked like a camera that never shut off, recording everything even when he wished it wouldn't. In the early summer when he was 32, Dawson decided to begin a series about northern ghost communities. He wanted to explore remote places where winter ruled the land and where silence had its own weight. He spent weeks circling names on a map pinned above his desk in Calgary. One place kept catching his eye, like it refused to stay quiet. A settlement called Keyser Ridge, tucked deep in the far northwest, not far from the Alaska border. He read that Keyser Ridge used to be a small weather outpost and a fueling point during the war. It had been slowly abandoned until only a few seasonal trappers remained. Dawson had never heard of it, but the climate records fascinated him. The region had once recorded temperatures so cold they cut through clothing like knives. He imagined how life must have felt there back when the last families left. The way the cold probably sank into their bones. The way their breath must have hung like ghosts in the air. He booked a flight to the Yukon, rented a rugged four-wheel drive in the city, and drove along long, rough gravel roads that tore at the tires and rattled his teeth. He followed the map until his phone lost connection, and the only sound came from the engine, the occasional bird, and the faraway groan of the wind rolling between tall mountains. He had arranged to stay at a lodge owned by a trapper who ran a small cabin about a dozen kilometers from the old settlement. The man had told him to avoid the abandoned mine shafts in the area, warning him the ground was unstable and the tunnels could collapse without any warning. Dawson arrived at the lodge on August 8th, just after sunset, tired but excited. He carried emergency supplies, a satellite phone, cold weather gear, and his heavy camera equipment. He always traveled like someone expecting things to go wrong, because too many times they already had. On his second day, August 9th, he drove to the remains of Keyser Ridge. The place greeted him with a silence so empty it almost made his chest tighten. Wooden buildings leaned sideways like tired skeletons. Rusted machines sat half buried in dirt and frozen mud. Old concrete foundations hid under creeping moss. He walked through the settlement, taking pictures and writing notes while the wind murmured across the valley floor. After hours of wandering, he followed an old road leading toward Warren Hills. The gravel shifted under his boots, and the air tasted still and heavy. That was when he noticed fresh tire marks pressed into the dirt. Very recent, judging by the sharp lines. He paused, confused, because the lodge owner said no one came this way anymore. The tracks curved toward the hills, disappearing behind a ridge. Curiosity tugged at him until he followed. The tracks led him to a collapsed mine entrance, the same one the trapper warned him about. But there was something Dawson did not expect. A modern generator hummed behind a pile of stones, barely visible unless someone knew to look. A thick power cable led directly into the opening of the mine. Not old, not abandoned, not forgotten. Someone was using the darkness inside. The moment felt wrong, like stepping into a house you thought was empty only to hear faint breathing in the next room. Dawson announced himself, but the wind swallowed his voice. No one replied. His instincts told him to turn back, but his curiosity won, the same curiosity that had pulled him into places that changed him forever. He took a slow breath and stepped inside the mine, the smell of cold earth mixing with something damp and metallic. He walked down a narrow tunnel, nearly 2 meters high, barely wide enough for him and his backpack. The air grew colder as he moved deeper, and water dripped somewhere in the darkness, echoing like distant footsteps. After almost 20 meters, the tunnel opened into a chamber. A place that should have been empty, but it was not. Blankets lay stacked neatly in a corner. Bottles of water sat beside a camp stove. Boxes of canned food rested near a small table, and covering an entire stone wall were photographs. Row after row of faces printed in different sizes, each one marked with careful handwriting underneath. Dawson approached slowly, feeling the cold in his fingers and the thump of his heartbeat in his ears. He scanned the photos. Dozens of people. Men, women, teenagers, different cities from across Western Canada written beneath them. A few taken from news sites. Others looked like they were captured from a distance without the subject noticing. The handwriting listed names, ages, heights, last known locations, and beneath every cluster of these faces was a single word scrawled in thick black ink. Taken, 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 taken. A wave of fear moved through Dawson's stomach. The chamber felt tighter, like the walls were creeping inward. He pulled out his camera and photographed the entire room, documenting everything with shaking hands. He zoomed on the handwriting, the faces, the details, desperate to record every piece of information. He had never seen anything like this. It felt like stepping into the mind of someone watching people, following them, collecting them, someone preparing for something terrible. He wanted to leave, to run back through the tunnel, but he kept photographing until a sound froze him in place. Footsteps from a deeper tunnel. Slow, heavy, steady. Not the wind. Not an animal. Someone walking. Someone walking. Someone returning. Dawson's throat tightened. He turned off his flashlight, pressing himself against the cold wall while his breath trembled inside his chest. A beam of light swept along the far tunnel, moving with intention. He realized there was no safe place to hide. If he waited, he would be seen, and if he moved, he would be heard. He chose to run. He clicked his flashlight on and sprinted toward the entrance. Behind him came a shout, sharp and furious, echoing through the mine. Footsteps pounded against stone, gaining speed. Dawson stumbled through the tunnel, scraping his arm against rock, not caring about anything except the opening ahead. He burst into daylight with burning lungs, scrambled into his truck, and tore down the rough road without looking back. The trees blurred as he sped through the valley, the steering wheel slipping slightly beneath his sweat-covered hands. Back at the lodge, he locked the doors and sank to the floor, shaking. When he managed to steady his breathing, he grabbed the satellite phone and called the RCMP detachment in Dawson City. He recounted everything, step by step, describing the photos, the tracking notes, the generator, and the person who had chased him. The dispatcher listened quietly, then told him officers were already on their way. Dawson waited. Every creak in the cabin made him jump. His mind would not stop replaying the images on the mine wall. He tried to focus on the photographs he took, zooming through them on his camera screen until the officers arrived around 8 that evening. They sat with him, asking precise questions. They looked through his camera, studying the pictures with serious faces. They asked him to describe the route to the mine. They asked if he noticed tire tracks anywhere else. They asked if he used any substances or felt faint during the day. He answered everything, grateful they believed something happened. The officers left for the mine, telling him to remain at the lodge. He could not sleep. The hours dragged, the night whispering through the cracks of the old cabin walls. At 2:19 in the morning, he heard gravel shift outside like something moved near the truck. He peeked through the curtains and saw nothing. He knew fear could twist sounds, but he could not stop his mind from racing. The officers returned around 4. Their boots were wet with mud, their clothes dusted with fine dirt. Dawson stood as soon as the door opened, desperate for answers. The officers told him calmly that they found the mine. The location matched exactly. But inside, the chamber was empty. No blankets, no water, no stove, no photographs, just bare stone. Not a single sign anyone had lived there. They searched every surface. There were no marks where tapes or pens might have held pictures, no prints in the dirt from boxes or equipment. Nothing at all. They asked him to show the photographs on his camera again. Dawson clicked through them. The screen showed darkness, flat rock walls, empty ground. His pictures of the faces, the handwriting, the objects were all gone. The images looked like he had taken them in an empty mine, not in a room filled with evidence. His stomach twisted as he stared at the photos. He knew what he had seen. He knew he photographed the faces carefully, but the evidence was gone, replaced by emptiness so absolute it felt like someone wiped the camera clean of truth. The officers asked again if he had been drinking. He said no. They asked if he had a history of anxiety or delusions. He said no. They remained polite, but he could feel doubt deepening in their eyes. Without physical evidence, they could not open an investigation. They filed a report and left. Dawson stayed awake until dawn, unable to blink without seeing those faces again. He returned to Calgary days later, moving back into a rented room in a quiet suburb where the nights felt too still. He tried focusing on other stories, but his mind stayed locked inside that mine. He checked missing persons databases for months, searching for any face that matched his memory. He thought he found a few similarities, but without names or dates, he could not be certain. He became quieter, he wrote less. But he never spoke publicly about the mine again. He knew people would call him unstable, and he could not afford to lose what was left of his credibility. He returned to writing about disappearances, but there was always a part of him trapped in that cold chamber, and he knew something had happened there. He just did not know how. Sometimes the horror followed him home, slipping into his everyday life in strange ways. In his Calgary neighborhood, the garage sensor of the house he rented would detect an opening every night at 3:17 a.m., even though the door remained closed. He checked it over and over, but the sensor always flickered at the same minute, the same second. His landlord told him it was faulty wiring, but Dawson felt something watching the house when he stood in the dark hallway. One evening, he walked through Nose Hill Park, trying to clear his mind. The sky faded to deep blue as he followed a familiar gravel path. A sudden burst of noise rushed behind him, like something sprinting at impossible speed, kicking stones and breaking branches. Dawson turned, expecting an animal or a person, but the trail was empty. He stood alone while the echoes faded. At a construction site near his street, a worker told him he often heard footsteps on the wooden floors long before anyone else arrived at dawn. He laughed it off, but admitted the steps always slowed down right behind him, as if someone followed without breathing. The coincidences piled like stones on Dawson's chest. Then, weeks after returning from the Yukon, he woke up at 2:43 a.m. to the sound of soft tapping on his window. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. He pulled the curtain aside and saw no one, but the glass held a faint outline, like the imprint of a forehead pressed too close. He stared at it until morning. He told himself he imagined it. But deep down he wondered if something from that mine had followed him, something hidden behind the faces of the taken, something walking quietly among places no one watched anymore. He kept searching missing persons lists late into the night. He kept hoping for a face he recognized. He kept dreaming of the chamber even though he prayed not to. The RCMP never called him again. Sometimes Dawson wondered if the mine had ever existed at all, or if the person who chased him that day was the one who erased everything before help arrived. Yet he could feel eyes somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting, remembering. Reed Hanlon grew up in a tiny fishing community on the rugged coast of Nova Scotia, a place where storms slammed into worn docks and fog twisted around the houses like slow, pale fingers. His father had been a boat mechanic, his mother worked seasonally gutting fish in a processing shed, and Reed spent most of his childhood wandering the cliff paths alone. People said he had a quiet mind and an eye for detail, something he later turned into a career as a restoration carpenter. He specialized in repairing old structures, especially remote cabins and heritage buildings that most contractors refused because the work was too isolated or unpredictable. That was how, in the early spring of a distant year, when he was 34, Reed found himself hired by a small cultural committee in the mountain town of Brackenridge, a quiet settlement tucked deep inside the northern interior region of British Columbia. Brackenridge had fewer than 2,000 residents, and it sat cradled between spruce forests and pale rocky ridges where winter lasted far too long. The committee had purchased an abandoned community chapel built in the late 1940s, hoping to restore it into a public gathering place for seniors and isolated families. The chapel stood 15 kilometers outside town, near a frozen lake and a defunct ski resort that had been shut down after several bad seasons. Reed accepted the job for 2 reasons. First, the pay was steady, and he needed stability after losing 3 months of work to storms back home. Second, he felt drawn to the chapel the moment he saw pictures of it, as if the building was calling him. He couldn't explain that pull, only that the place seemed to wait for someone who understood wood and memory and silence. He arrived in Brackenridge on April 6th. The air smelled like melting ice. Snowbanks lay knee-deep around the hotel parking lot, and ravens hopped along the eaves. The chapel was a 30-minute drive from town, located down a narrow road still rimmed with snow. It was small, 1-story white paint peeling in long curls, the roof sagging near the bell tower. Most windows were cracked or frost-fogged. Nature had chewed the structure slowly, yet there was still something dignified in the frame. Reed spent his first day documenting damage, taking photographs, sketching the interior, and creating a plan for the renovation stages. He knew he would be working alone most days, with only the occasional help of a day laborer to lift beams or move debris. He did not mind isolation. He trusted the quiet more than people. The second day began earlier than he intended. He reached the chapel at 8 in the morning, or 8 o'clock as he told himself, the sky still dim with leftover night. Snow crunched under his boots. The lake beside the property looked like cracked glass. He unlocked the chapel door, pushed it open, and the stale smell of old wood and damp insulation drifted over him. The interior reminded him of countless forgotten buildings across rural Canada. Simple wooden rows facing a small altar, water stains creeping down the walls, patches of mold curling in the corners. To the left was a storage room, to the right a cramped office. His plan was to clear out the old seating first, since many of the benches were softened by rot and riddled with insects. Using a pry bar and mallet, he worked carefully, trying not to damage anything salvageable. By mid-morning, he had created a messy pile of stripped lumber near the door. Light slanted through the broken glass in thin, cold beams. By 11:30, Reed moved toward the front of the chapel. The altar was a basic wooden frame, badly warped, but he tried to measure it anyway. Behind the altar hung a simple wooden cross nailed to the wall, the paint chipped and flaking like dried bone. He tapped the wall around it, expecting solid backing. At first, everything sounded normal. Then his knuckles landed on a section that echoed faintly, a hollow thump instead of a firm, dense sound. He frowned. He knocked again, first to the left, then to the right. Only one area, roughly a meter wide from floor to ceiling, rang empty. He leaned closer. He saw the faintest difference in the wood grain. This panel looked newer, installed maybe 30 years after the rest. He slid his pry bar beneath the seam and pushed. The board snapped outward in a dusty cough. Behind the panel was not the original wall, but a crude skeleton of 2x6 pieces arranged into a makeshift partition. Someone had intentionally built a barrier. Someone had sealed something away. A prickle slid across Reed's scalp. He told himself unusual modifications were common in abandoned buildings, especially chapels where volunteers over the decades added shelves or closets or makeshift confession rooms. Yet something about this felt wrong. The hidden space looked intentional in a way that set his teeth on edge. He tore down 3 more boards, creating a gap wide enough to step through. He raised his flashlight. The beam fell across a small, windowless room. Bare concrete walls, no fixtures. Nothing on the ceiling. And on the floor, arranged in 3 perfect circles like a strange ritual pattern, were dozens upon dozens of small shoes. Children's shoes. They were tiny, worn, coated in dust. Leather, canvas, simple styles from decades ago, some no bigger than a toddler's foot, some slightly larger. All placed with toes pointed toward the center of the circles. There must have been 50 or more, intact despite their age, as if untouched by time except for dust and silence. Reed froze. His breath felt stuck in his chest. Every instinct inside him tightened. He whispered a sound that was not quite a word, more like disbelief mixed with dread. He crouched in the opening, his flashlight trembling slightly. He leaned closer to look but refused to step inside. Names. He could see faint names inside some of the shoes, ink faded but still legible. Names like Drew, Lila, Marcus, Nola, Tamara, Rowan. Names he did not recognize, but names that belonged to real children who had once worn those shoes, walked in them, played in them, maybe lost them, maybe had them taken. He backed away and stumbled into the main room of the chapel. His mind tried to ground itself. He reached for his phone and saw no signal. He thought of driving back to town, of calling the police, but something inside him whispered that he should at least make sure there was nothing else hidden in that small, cold room. Against his better judgment, he widened the opening and stepped inside. The air was heavier, colder, carrying the faint scent of mildew. His boots echoed hollowly. He moved the beam of his flashlight across the room again and again until it fell on the far corner. A square of concrete on the floor looked fresher, smoother, not bonded properly to the surrounding slab. He knelt and lifted the edge. The entire patch lifted like a thick tile. Underneath was dirt, loose and disturbed. Something soft but frayed poked out of the soil. He dug with gloved fingers until cloth emerged. A tiny blue shirt, a pale purple dress, a pair of small corduroy pants. Nothing else. No bones. No forms. Only clothing. Reed jerked backward, heart hammering. He carried the concrete patch back into place, though it shifted crookedly. He stumbled out of the hidden chamber and rushed for his truck. The chapel door swung shut behind him with a dull slam that made him jump. He drove 10 kilometers before his phone lit up with a signal. He stopped beside a gas station and used the old payphone outside to call the RCMP. His report came out fast and shaky. The dispatcher told him to return to the chapel and wait. He drove back with his jaw clenched, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned pale. He refused to re-enter the building, instead standing by his truck watching the tree line. The wind hissed across the snow. The lake cracked loudly in the distance, sharp like breaking glass. After 40 minutes, 2 RCMP officers arrived. Reed led them inside. He pointed at the hidden wall, the room, the circles of shoes. One officer radioed immediately for a forensic team. They sectioned off the property, set up barriers, recorded everything. Reed spent the next 5 hours answering questions again and again until the daylight began to fade. A larger team arrived from the nearest city the following morning. They used ground-penetrating radar on the property and found several irregular soil pockets scattered around the chapel yard. Small pits, shallow depressions, disturbed earth. They dug slowly, carefully. They found more children's clothing, more tiny belongings. A small metal car, a wooden bead bracelet. A cloth hair tie faded to nearly white, but they did not find bodies. No bones, no physical remains. Only objects, buried deliberately. Investigators traced the chapel's history. They learned that a man named Reverend Hector Lorne had served there from 1953 until 1972, when he abruptly resigned and left the province. Parish records reported he moved to central Alberta. Other records showed gaps in his employment. Some placed him in rural Manitoba, living under a shortened version of his surname. A death certificate surfaced eventually. He had died in 1998 of cancer, buried under a different name, no family listed. People in Brackenridge barely remembered him. Those who did said he preferred spending time with children from remote families, often giving rides to kids whose parents worked long mill shifts. Some remembered that a few children from scattered logging camps had gone missing during those years, but no official links had ever been proven. Many cases were lost in changing jurisdictions, missing files, transient workers, old record-keeping failures. The police could not prove anything. Suspicion grew, but evidence did not. The committee that hired Reeve canceled the restoration project permanently. The chapel became a sealed site, declared protected under an active but unsolved investigation. The chain-link fence went up. Warning signs hung from it. Locals grew uneasy. Some claimed they saw pale flickering inside the shuttered building on windless nights. Others heard what sounded like small footsteps across the snow, even when the snow remained completely untouched. Reed tried to distance himself after the investigation slowed. He finished his statements, handed over his field notes, and went back to his rented room near town. But sleep became a stranger. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 3 concentric circles of shoes. He thought about the names. He wondered how many families never knew what happened to their children. He wondered who buried those items and why the bodies were never found. By early autumn, he moved again, this time to Vancouver Island, hoping that water and salt air might wash away the images etched into his thoughts. He took smaller, simpler repair jobs, avoiding anything older than 20 years. He avoided isolated places. He avoided silence. But his nightmares never stopped. Some nights he dreamed of the hidden room expanding into a corridor lined with shoes that shuffled on their own. Some nights he dreamed he heard weak tapping against thin wooden walls. Some nights he dreamed he followed footprints in fresh snow, even though the snow was smooth when he looked back. Years passed, and Reed spoke little about Brackenridge. Only 2 close friends ever heard the full story. Even then, he told it slowly, with pauses long enough to hold breath. He once mentioned something that investigators never included in their official notes. Something he kept to himself because he thought people would call it imagination, stress, or exhaustion. It happened on the 3rd night after the discovery. He had returned home late, well past 9:30 p.m., and collapsed into bed. The mountains outside his window loomed black against the fading sky. He awoke sometime after 2. He didn't know the exact time at first, only that the room felt wrong. The air sank colder. A faint gust swept past his face as if someone had walked by the foot of his bed. He blinked at the shadows. He thought he heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside his door, slow and dragging. The hallway floor was carpeted. There should have been no sound at all. He reached for the lamp, but before he touched it, something else happened. The doorknob twitched. Once, twice. As though a child too small to reach it properly pressed their weight against the door. He lay frozen. His heartbeat thudded deep inside his ribs. The knob stilled. The cold gust faded, and somehow, when he finally looked at the alarm clock, the numbers read 2:43 a.m., as if something had chosen that exact moment to stand outside his room. He tried to explain the sensation later. He said it felt like the chapel's hidden room had followed him, that its silence trailed him at a distance, that whatever had lived inside those circles did not want to stay buried. People dismissed this. They blamed trauma. They blamed stress. Reed pretended to agree. But he remembered the other oddities at the old ski resort near the chapel. One of the lodge workers had told him they sometimes felt a sudden cold rush sweep down an empty hallway like an unseen figure moving past. Another said they heard footsteps late at night beneath the suspended ski lift, even when the snow on the ground stayed perfectly smooth. Someone else reported finding footprints outside the cabin windows that seemed to begin beyond the fence, almost as if a person materialized from nowhere. No one connected these stories to the missing children from decades earlier, but Reed did. He thought about the clothing buried around the property, small shirts, small dresses, shoes arranged like a warning or a memory or a ritual. He wondered if those circles were meant to hold something inside or keep something else out. The RCMP eventually boxed up the shoes as evidence, then returned them to living relatives decades after the disappearances. Not all were claimed. Some names matched no missing records. Those shoes remained unclaimed, locked in storage. Their owners unknown. Reed never stopped imagining them. Children whose names never reached police files. Children who vanished from families too scared or too transient to report them. Children who walked into the woods following a trusted adult and never walked out. He told himself he was being dramatic. But some nights, especially when winter crept up the island coast and the air cooled enough to see his breath indoors, he felt something brush past him like a cold draft, something quiet, something waiting. He moved into a small rental cabin near a river, taking care to check the snow each morning during winter. He looked for tracks, he looked for circles, he looked for small marks pressed lightly in the frost. One morning he found faint prints near his back steps, as if someone very small had stood there before dawn. The prints pointed toward the door. He did not remember hearing anything that night. He told himself they were animal tracks disturbed by melting ice. Another morning, just after a storm, he found a line of impressions leading toward the tree line. They were the size of a child's shoe. He cleaned them away with a shovel and refused to look at the forest the rest of the day. Over time, his friends noticed he avoided being anywhere near structures older than 50 years. He stopped going to community events. He spent evenings sitting up, staring at the clock until past midnight. He never explained why, only saying that he preferred to be awake before things moved. He never married, never settled. He carried the quiet weight of that hidden room inside him like packed earth inside a cracked floor. And though he never returned to Brackenridge, he often dreamed of standing in front of the chapel fence. He dreamed of pressing his hand against the cold chain link. He dreamed of the interior darkening behind the shuttered windows. He dreamed of faint tapping rising from under the floorboards. In those dreams, he always felt watched. Not by an adult, not by a man, but by many small, patient eyes waiting for someone to open the door again. And every time he woke, he found the same thing. His alarm clock would read 2:43 a.m. every single time. No one knows what really happened inside that hidden room decades ago. Investigators still hold the case open, waiting for a clue that may never arrive, and locals still whisper that the chapel hums at night with sounds too soft to be wind. Some claim the old ski lift near the frozen lake still creaks at night, as if an invisible weight rides it back and forth. Others say footprints appear beneath it after storms, even though no one uses the area anymore. There are stories of windows fogging, as if someone stands outside breathing against the glass. Stories of sudden cold drafts sweeping through empty corridors. Stories of small shapes flickering in the tree line near dawn. Reed does not share these stories, though he knows them. He sometimes feels as though the chapel waits for him to return, as if the circles of shoes sit untouched, waiting for the one who found them to come back and open the room again. As if unfinished business clings to him with silent persistence, but he never goes back. He never crosses the mountains. He never approaches Brackenridge. Still, he wonders where the bodies went. He wonders what those circles were meant for. He wonders why the items were not burned, but placed neatly, respectfully, almost lovingly. He wonders if Reverend Hector Lorne acted alone. He wonders if someone else moved inside that building long after the minister left. He wonders if the woods around the chapel ever released what they swallowed, and he fears the answer is no. Some things remain buried. Some things remain hidden. Some things wait for someone to see them again. Late at night, when the river outside his cabin whispers against the stones, Reed sometimes hears a faint scraping under the porch, soft like a small shoe sliding across wood. He tells himself it is nothing, but he never steps outside to check. Not anymore. Victoria was a school guidance counselor in the lakeside settlement of North Haven, a peaceful community tucked among spruce woods in central Manitoba where barely 800 people lived. She had moved there 12 years earlier after finishing university in Brandon, wanting a slower life, calm streets, and the comfort of working with young students. At 36 years old, Victoria had become one of the most respected staff members at the local school. Always patient, always gentle with the children who came to her small office with worries too big for their age. North Haven felt safe to her, a place where everyone recognized each other at the grocery store, where the lake froze like glass each winter, glowing under the moon, where people still waved at passing trucks on the long, winding road around the water. She lived alone in a house 10 kilometers outside town, an old wooden home built in the 40s with a full crawl-in basement and a narrow porch that wrapped around the west side. She loved her quiet evenings tending to her herb garden in summer and reading by her stove in winter. Solitude never frightened her, because in places like North Haven, solitude was normal. It was November 10th when everything changed, a sharp Wednesday where a heavy snowfall had covered the roads during the night and turned the world pale. Victoria spent her day helping her sixth graders prepare for winter break assignments and stayed long after school hours sorting through student reports. Her co-workers said she had been cheerful when she finally gathered her things and walked out into the chilled evening around 6. She drove her silver SUV through town, stopping at the small grocery market to pick up tea, bread, and 2 cans of stew. The clerk remembered chatting with her about the icy weather and hearing her laugh softly as she mentioned she wanted to get home to grade some papers. She left the store around 6:20. From there, she drove toward her house along the empty gravel road that cut through forests and frozen fields. Her nearest neighbors, the Dauka family, lived about 4 kilometers away, but the distance was common for rural North Haven and never bothered anyone. The Daukas later said they did not see or hear anything unusual that night. Snow muffled the world and nothing stirred. Around 7:29 p.m., Victoria called emergency services. The recording remains saved in the North Haven RCMP archives. Her voice sounded steady at first, calm in a way that felt too controlled, as if she was fighting panic. She told the dispatcher that someone was trying to get into her basement. The dispatcher asked what she heard. Victoria said scraping on the outside basement door, the one beneath her porch that opened directly to the lower level. She said the sound had been going on for 10 minutes, growing more frantic. The dispatcher asked if she had looked outside. Victoria said she had not, that all her curtains were closed and she was scared to open them. She said every lock was secured, that she always locked everything when she got home because the dark woods made her uneasy sometimes in winter. The dispatcher told her officers were being sent immediately and would arrive in 15 minutes. Only 2 patrol officers were active that night, and both were dispatched since the RCMP detachment sat at the center of the town 10 kilometers away. As they spoke, Victoria's voice shifted. She breathed faster and she whispered that the scratching had stopped. The dispatcher asked if that meant the person went away. Victoria said no. She said something had entered the basement. The dispatcher asked how. Victoria said she could hear slow, heavy footsteps moving inside, climbing the basement stairs, 1 step at a time, deliberate, each thud echoing through the old structure. The dispatcher told her to leave, to get to her front door and run to her vehicle. Victoria said she could not, because to reach the front entrance, she would have to pass the top of the basement staircase, and that staircase opened directly into the main hallway. She said she had already locked herself inside her upstairs bedroom. The dispatcher asked if there was another way out. Victoria said she had a bedroom window leading to the porch roof. She could climb out and drop down. The dispatcher encouraged her to do it quickly. There was quiet. Then Victoria whispered that the footsteps had stopped. She said everything was silent now. The dispatcher told her this was her chance. Victoria agreed. Listeners of the recording later said they could hear her move, the creak of floorboards, the groan of the window frame shifting. Then came Victoria's sharp gasp. The dispatcher asked what was wrong. Victoria did not speak at first. When she did, her voice had changed. It became soft, hollow, distant. She said someone was standing at the bottom of the upstairs stairs, facing her bedroom door. She said she could see through the small gap under the door. She said she saw boots, large work boots, perfectly still on the landing. The dispatcher told her again to leave through the window. Victoria said she was going to. The recording captured her moving again toward the window. Then the sound changed instantly, A violent crash echoed through the speaker, the sound of wood splitting apart. Victoria screamed. The dispatcher called her name and begged for a response. The audio shook with chaos, impacts, something falling, then silence as the call cut out. Officers reached her property at 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes after the call. The house was almost entirely dark, except for a dim yellow glow in the upstairs window. The officers approached cautiously. The front door was unlocked. They stepped inside and called out. Everything in the living room and kitchen was undisturbed. No furniture overturned, nothing broken. The basement door in the hallway was closed. They climbed the stairs and found Victoria's bedroom door on the floor inside the room, ripped from its hinges. The wood around the lock was shattered, splinters scattered across the old rug. Victoria was not upstairs. They found her in the basement, lying at the bottom of the stairs, as if someone had set her there deliberately. She lay flat on her back with her arms straight at her sides. Her eyes were open, reflecting the thin beam of the officers' flashlights. There was no sign of injury, no blood, no bruises. Paramedics arrived soon after and confirmed she was gone. The coroner was notified. An autopsy found no cause of death. Her heart had stopped, but no medical reason existed. She had no wounds, no signs of suffocation or trauma, no chemicals, no toxins, nothing unusual in her bloodstream. She had been healthy. The coroner listed the death as unexplained. The investigation into her home raised even more confusion. The basement door that led outside was locked from the inside. The deep scratch marks on its outside surface looked fresh. Small curls of paint lay in the snow beneath it, but the deadbolt could only be turned from within. No footprints surrounded the area, no sign of forced entry anywhere else. Inside the basement, nothing was displaced. Dust sat untouched on boxes and furniture. There were no tracks, no smudges, no signs anyone had walked there. The bedroom door had been forced open with such strength that investigators said it looked as if someone had rammed it several times with unnatural force. Yet Victoria's call lasted only 16 minutes from the moment she reported something entering her home to the moment it disconnected. Investigators said that was not enough time for a person to break the door, overpower her, carry her downstairs, position her body, and leave no trace. More strangeness followed. The phone line to her house, inspected by technicians, had been cut. The severed section was found 2 meters from the connection point, sliced cleanly with what looked like wire cutters. But the phone company tested the timeline and estimated the cut had occurred at least 20 minutes before Victoria's call at 7:29 p.m. They insisted no call could be made on a severed line, but the call existed. The recording was real. The dispatcher remembered every second of it. The officers had responded because of it. Officers questioned the Dalka family, but they said they had noticed nothing. They had not even seen headlights pass their home on the road that evening. Other residents within a 7-kilometer radius reported nothing unusual either. Victoria's SUV was parked beside her porch, untouched. Her purse was on her kitchen counter. Nothing taken, no sign of theft, no sign of struggle. Investigators dug into her personal life. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and her sister. Everyone described Victoria as balanced, helpful, warm-hearted, and loved by the children she worked with. She had no enemies, no illnesses, no strange behavior. Her bank accounts were clean, her messages normal. No one reported any odd letters or calls. People in North Haven whispered about the case for months. Some said Victoria had suffered a sudden heart problem and imagined the intruder, but that did not explain the damage to the door, or the cut phone line, or her body being placed so neatly, or the boot she claimed to see, or the silence after her scream. Others whispered about something older. North Haven had always carried small rumors, stories told around bonfires in summer. There was an abandoned hydro station near the far side of the lake with doors that locals sometimes heard slamming shut on windless nights. A humming sound came from the tree line at the town's edge sometimes, a low vibration that stopped the moment a person walked toward it. Some people said a soaked jacket would appear on porches after sundown during the coldest months, dripping water as if pulled from the lake, yet no footprints ever connected to it. Within weeks of Victoria's death, The Dalka family decided to move. They told friends it was unrelated, but their faces showed fear. Eventually, after persistent questioning, Mrs. Dalka shared that she had heard scratching on their basement door late at night more than once. Their dogs growled at empty corners of the yard. Mr. Commerce of the yard, Dalka said he had seen a silhouette standing at the far end of their field at dusk on 3 different days. Each time, the figure stayed perfectly still until he walked closer, then vanished without sound. Other families near the woods reported things too, whispering under their porches when the wind wasn't blowing. Wet footprints leading to their barn doors, then ending suddenly. A humming sound that made their windows vibrate but stopped as soon as they opened the door. No one could prove anything, and the RCMP received no solid evidence of wrongdoing, but the tension in North Haven grew heavy. By late 2024, the case had gone cold. No new clues surfaced. Victoria's family held a quiet memorial. People tried to move on, though whispers lingered like frost on tree branches. The house was eventually bought by a retired couple from Winnipeg. They lived there for 4 years and reported nothing out of the ordinary. They sold the property to a young forestry worker, who later said sometimes he felt watched when he walked the yard at night, but he brushed it off his imagination. After him, the house changed hands twice more. Some owners described strange events, others none at all. But stories kept returning, like old echoes that refused to die. Visitors to the abandoned hydro station continued hearing the heavy metal door slam in the middle of the night even when the air was still. Residents near the woods still mentioned that strange humming that stopped when approached, and once, a family near the lake found a wet jacket on their porch every night for a week. They threw it away each time, but by the next morning another hung there, dripping water onto the wooden boards. What happened to Victoria on November 10th remained unanswered. She had made a call on a dead phone line. She had described footsteps and boots that left nothing behind. She had died with no reason. Her body moved without trace, her door destroyed by a force no one could explain. People said North Haven was peaceful again, but on frozen winter nights, when the wind paused and the lake sat silent under the moon, some swore they could still hear slow footsteps climbing unseen stairs somewhere deep within the woods, steps that always stopped the moment you tried to listen closer. Miles had grown up far from Maple Hollow, raised in a flat prairie town where he learned early that mistakes stayed visible in wide-open land. His childhood was simple. His parents worked ordinary jobs, and he spent most of his days biking along dirt roads that split sunburned fields. By the time he turned 18, he wanted something quieter, colder, something that felt untouched by the world. He found that feeling years later when he moved to a remote Canadian town called Maple Hollow, a place surrounded by deep pine forests, frozen rivers, and long winters that felt older than memory. Miles worked as a wildlife cartographer, the kind of job that had him hiking through frozen trails with measuring tools, notebooks, and a radio clipped to his coat. People in Maple Hollow trusted him because he knew the land better than most new arrivals. He learned every narrow trail, every ridge, every frozen creek, and he never acted careless with weather or distance. He was responsible, steady, and always back at camp before dark. No one ever worried about him, especially during winter when everything slowed down and only the most experienced workers were allowed near the forest edge. It was late January, the kind of January where cold felt like a weight on the skin. Snow fell in quiet sheets, temperatures dropped so low water bottles froze solid in minutes, and wind from the nearby lake scraped across the surface like living teeth. Miles loved it anyway. He said cold kept the world honest, that nothing could hide in weather like this. But Maple Hollow had been hiding things long before he arrived. On the morning of January 15th, Miles woke at his usual time, a little after 5 in the morning. His roommate, a heavy sleeper named Owen, remembered hearing the soft clatter of Miles moving around their small cabin. Owen said he smelled fresh coffee, the scent warm and sharp against the cold air inside. He drifted back into sleep without checking the time, but he was sure Miles left before dawn. When Owen finally sat up around 7, Miles was already gone. That never surprised anyone. Miles loved starting early, especially when the forecast warned of thick snow later in the afternoon. Owen assumed Miles was headed toward the southern ridge, a place about 4 kilometers away across a frozen marshland the workers used as a shortcut. The marsh had been frozen solid since late November. Trucks drove across it every day to reach the supply shed on the far side. The ice was thick, dependable, and Miles himself had measured the depth with a drill 2 days earlier. He told Owen the ice was stronger than concrete that week. He left that morning on foot, carrying his backpack of equipment. He wore insulated boots, a bulky winter coat, layered thermal clothing, a beanie pulled low, gloves stuffed under his sleeves, and most importantly, a bright yellow vest that stood out against endless snow. Several workers saw him walking away from the camp around 5:20 in the morning. A few nodded at him as he passed. Everything about him looked normal. By noon, he still had not returned or checked in. That was the first sign something was wrong. Radio check-ins were required, especially when working alone near the marsh. The supervisor tried calling him 3 times. No answer. He tried again and again, but the radio stayed silent. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a search team was assembled. 6 workers, including Owen, headed toward the marsh following the route Miles always took. Visibility was clear, wind low, sunlight bright. No fresh snowfall had fallen since morning. This meant footprints were easy to track. About halfway across the frozen marsh, the search team stopped walking without planning to, because right in front of them, Miles's footprints were clear, deep, and normal in their pattern. They followed the exact path expected from someone walking across familiar ground, but then, without any sign of turning, stumbling, slowing, or stepping sideways, the footprints simply ended. They ended in the middle of the ice. No cracks. No hole, no broken pieces. No snow disturbed. His final step was pressed firm into the surface, heel to toe, and then no more steps existed. It looked as if the rest of his path had been cut from the world. The team stared in silence. Owen knelt beside the last footprint, his breath shaking in the cold. He called Miles's name but got no echo across the frozen marsh. The air swallowed his voice. They drilled test holes into the ice beneath the last print. The ice was nearly 1.5 meters thick. No human could fall through without leaving shards or water stains. The surface was solid, hard, old. They expanded the search outward in every direction. Nothing. No tracks returning to camp. No tracks leading anywhere else. There were no signs of animals, no snowmobile marks, no struggle, no drag marks, nothing that suggested Miles had taken another step. It was like he vanished mid-stride. By evening, local authorities were notified. Maple Hollow did not have its own detachment large enough for a case like this, so officers came from a larger town an hour away. Drones with thermal cameras swept the landscape. Search dogs were brought in. Ground teams combed the forest edges. Helicopters circled overhead, dragging light over the snow, yet nothing moved down below. Divers were brought in too, though everyone agreed there was no chance he fell through. Still, protocol demanded they check. They drilled wide holes and lowered cameras beneath the ice. Nothing showed. The world under the ice was silent, empty, untouched. Days passed. The search grew to cover nearly 70 square kilometers around the marsh. Not a single glove, not a scrap of fabric, not a broken tool from his backpack, not a radio battery, not a single extra footprint. Miles had walked into the marsh and simply stopped existing. Investigators checked his cabin. Coffee still sat half-finished in the mug on the counter. His bed was neatly made. His notebook lay open on the table with a sketch of the southern ridge he planned to map that morning. Nothing unusual. The radio logs showed no distress signals. The equipment he had used the previous day at the southern ridge was discovered exactly as he left it. His measuring tools were still set up on a tripod beside a small fir tree. His notes, stashed in a small metal box, were dry and organized. His last entry was calm, ordinary, written with steady handwriting. He expected to return that morning. Workers were questioned. Owen said Miles seemed normal when he left. No panic, no strange behavior, no complaint about weather or routes. Nothing was out of place. 3 weeks after Miles disappeared, things got stranger. A local resident named Jonah Crane was hiking near the western woods, close to an abandoned school building no one had used in nearly 30 years. Jonah often hiked alone in winter, checking traps and taking photos of tracks. Around mid-afternoon on February 4th, he saw someone standing near the edge of the tree line about 30 meters away. The figure faced away, unmoving. The posture, height, and build reminded Jonah of the missing cartographer everyone had been searching for. He called out, asking if the person needed help. No movement. He walked closer. The figure wore dark clothing and stood so still Jonah felt uneasy. When he reached about 20 meters away, he saw a flash of yellow under the coat. A yellow vest, the same bright kind Miles always wore. Jonah's stomach dropped. He shouted Miles's name. The figure did not respond. Instead, the figure took a slow step backward. Then another. It did not turn. It did not look around. It simply moved backward, gliding across the snow with the same posture, the same stillness, sliding between the trees without bending or shifting its shoulders like a normal person would when avoiding branches. Jonah knew the forest well. He ran the moment the figure disappeared into the trees. When he reached the spot where he saw the movement, there were no footprints, no marks. No broken branches, no trail. Nothing to show anyone had been there. When he reported this to authorities, he looked pale, shaking. Officers interviewed him 3 times. His story never changed. He insisted he saw someone wearing a yellow vest. He insisted the figure moved backward into the trees. He insisted there were no tracks in the snow. Another search was launched. Nothing was found. More strange events followed, whispered first, spoken later. Every night around the same time, people saw a single pair of headlights on the old road leading toward the abandoned school. The headlights always appeared in the same place, bright and clear, but every time they reached the curve in the road, they blinked out as if swallowed by the dark. Kids said they heard chalkboard scraping inside the abandoned school at night, long, slow drags across dusty slate, even though the building had no power and no one had keys to enter. Adults admitted hearing it too, but none wanted to say it out loud. The worst were the slow claps. At the forest edge, 3 claps always echoed late at night. Always 3, always spaced far apart, each one sharp, deliberate, cold. Cabin windows shook from the sound, though nothing moved outside. Dogs hid. People locked their doors. No one would walk near the forest after dark. Owen refused to cross the marsh again. He said he felt something watching from beneath the ice, something cold and patient. Others agreed. Workers requested a new route to the southern ridge. The company approved a road construction project claiming it would increase efficiency, but everyone knew they only wanted to avoid the place Miles vanished. Families in town whispered about shadows moving near the lake and figures standing between trees at dawn. They talked about footsteps following behind them that disappeared when they turned. They talked about radios picking up faint breathing on empty channels. Maple Hollow seemed to hold its breath after Miles vanished, as if the land itself waited for something else to slip away. Months passed. Authorities kept the file open. Miles's family visited, walked the marsh, cried at the last footprint. They begged for answers. None existed. They returned home with the same empty silence everyone else had. Rumors spread like wind. People said Maple Hollow had always been wrong. People said the marsh took things it wanted. People said some places were older than rules or logic. Some said Miles walked into something not meant for people. Jonah stopped hiking near the western woods. He said he could not bear the memory of that figure sliding backward into the dark. He told friends he felt like something watched him every time he closed his eyes. Some nights he swore he heard 3 slow claps outside his window, even when snow buried the ground thick and no one could walk without leaving a mark. The abandoned school became a place no one passed after sundown. People reported chalkboard scraping even during windless nights. A few swore they heard someone whispering from inside, but whispers always stopped when anyone approached. By the time spring arrived, Maple Hollow carried the disappearance like a bruise beneath ice. The marsh thawed, but no answers surfaced. Teams returned to check again, but like winter, spring showed nothing. The only memory left was the last footprint pressed deep into frozen ground, and the stories whispered in the town about backward-walking figures, vanishing headlights, chalkboard scratches, and claps that never changed their pattern. 3 claps. Always 3. People continued to move through Maple Hollow, but they avoided the marsh if they could. Some workers left the town entirely. They said they could not stand the feeling of being watched when crossing open land. Others stayed but changed their routines, avoiding lonely trails and frozen ponds. Many set extra locks on their doors. The town never said it openly, but everyone understood something had taken Miles in a way nothing natural ever could. As months turned into a full year, Maple Hollow stopped pretending it was an ordinary town. People no longer doubted the strange things they saw. No one dismissed the shadows. No one joked about the noise from the school. No one shrugged off the headlights. They began to carry those experiences quietly, heavily, like a weight on their backs. Some evenings, Owen went to the marsh alone despite fear twisting his stomach. He stood where the footprints ended, staring at the ground, hoping something would change. Nothing ever did. But he always felt something near him, something cold brushing across the air like breath from deep below. He never heard Miles again. Never saw him. But some nights, when wind moved across the land in long, lonely sighs, Owen thought he heard footsteps behind him. They were always soft, always slow, always stopping the moment he turned around. Maple Hollow never forgot Miles. The workers avoided mentioning him, but they all remembered the calm way he walked across the marsh that morning. They remembered his yellow vest. They remembered the emptiness beyond his last step. The forest remembered him too. Some nights, people said they saw a shape standing among the trees wearing a yellow vest that glowed faint like a lantern in the dark, but the shape never faced them. It always stood still, watching the ground, waiting, and if anyone took a step toward it, it always slid backward into the dark, leaving no prints behind. Even now, the marsh holds its silence. The abandoned school stays locked in cold air. The forest edges carry the sound of 3 slow claps on certain winter nights. 3. Always 3. Maple Hollow remains quiet, frozen, watchful. People go on with their lives, but they walk as if the ground beneath them might open, or the forest might shift, or the marsh might swallow sound itself. Nothing ever explained how Miles vanished on that January morning. Nothing ever will. The last footprint stays in the memory of the town, pressed deeper than snow or ice, reminding everyone that some places take without leaving anything behind.